deities in the land under one roof, to honor Seti with their presence, was part of a conscious effort to establish the theological credentials of the new Ramesside dynasty. The theme of dynastic legitimacy was reinforced in a long corridor that led southward from the columned hall. Its exquisite relief decoration showed Seti's eldest son, Prince Ramses, reading a papyrus inscribed with the names of 67 royal predecessors, stretching all the way back to Menes, legendary founder of the Egyptian state. The Abju king list drew upon ancient temple archives, but its primary purpose was religious rather than historical. Designed to stress the unbroken succession of rightful monarchs from the beginning of the first dynasty down to Seti I and his son, it included the ephemeral kings of the first intermediate period, but conspicuously omitted the hated Hyksos, the dubious Hatshepsut, the heretic Akhenaten, and his three tainted successors. In the context of a royal ancestor cult, such controversial forebears were best forgotten. Abju was the theological center of Seti's regime, and he went to extraordinary lengths to guarantee its proper functioning in perpetuity. First, he endowed it with substantial land and resources, many of them located in the farthest parts of conquered Nubia, where nobody could object. Next, Seti took a leaf out of Horemheb's book and promulgated a wide-ranging decree to protect the assets from improper appropriation by other institutions. Carved into the side of a sandstone hill near the Third Nile Cataract, in the vicinity of a fortified garrison, the Nori decree spelled out the penalty for requisitioning or interfering with the annual shipment of produce sent from Kush to Abju, having thus secured regular shipments of produce to fill the coffers of his temple. Seti set about guaranteeing an eternal supply of gold, the commodity above all others that betoken wealth. He ordered new gold mines to be opened up in Egypt's remote eastern desert, and took a close interest in the production and transport of the mines. Precious ore to the Nile Valley. An inscription at a remote temple in the Wadi Baramia recounts the king's personal involvement. His answer was to order the stonecutters to leave their mining posts and instead dig a well in the mountains, so that it might lift up the weary and refresh the spirit of him who burns in summer. 10. The king's penchant for innovation was also put to great effect in the preparation of his final resting place, a great royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Not only is it the longest and deepest of all the royal tombs at Thebes, but it was also the first to be decorated throughout. Every wall and ceiling of every passage and chamber is covered with the finest paintings and reliefs. This tomb established the decorative program that would be followed by all subsequent tombs in the valley until the very end of the New Kingdom. Amid such splendor, one masterwork is justly famed, the magnificent vaulted ceiling of the burial chamber, painted with astronomical scenes so as to resemble the very vault of heaven. The Ramesside dynasty might have been less than a decade old, but Seti I had no doubts about his immortal destiny. The tumbrils of war, restoring sacred sites to magnificence and endowing them with dazzling new monuments, was a tried and trusted way of rebuilding Egypt's domestic standing, but there was still the question of the country's international reputation. From his background as an army officer, Seti knew that influence on the world stage came from military strength. Yet not since the glory days of Amenhotep II had Egypt won a decisive victory in the Near East. Under Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, attempts to extend or even defend imperial possessions in Syria had been wholly ineffective. Horemheb had tried to reassert Egyptian hegemony, but with mixed results. Egypt's reputation as a great power was seriously compromised, its overseas territories vulnerable to secession or seizure by the Hittites, and its mastery of trade routes threatened. Action was urgently needed if the Ramesside's inheritance was not to disappear before their very eyes. Seti had lost no time, launching his first campaign while still crown prince. He had fought his way along the Phoenician coast to reassert Egypt's traditional sphere of influence, and to secure Egypt's continued access to the Mediterranean harbors, with their garrisons and trading wharfs. At the start of his sole reign in 1290, he led further campaigns with similar strategic objectives. The first people to feel Egypt's wrath were the Bedouin of northern Sinai. Struggles between their fractious tribes were not a hazard to Egyptian security per se, but they did threaten the country's main supply lines to its imperial possessions in Syria-Palestine. Seti knew that control of the northern Sinai coastal route was a necessary prerequisite for more ambitious military maneuvers. Having reimposed Egyptian authority in his own backyard, he moved onward into Canaan, regaining control of the key fortified towns of Beth Shan and Yenom. He then set the seal on Egypt's victory by forcing the chiefs of Lebanon to hew wood in his presence, a public act of submission to the pharaoh that also emphasized Egypt's claim over the region's abundant natural resources. In earlier times, small-scale local actions of this sort would not have required the personal presence of the king at the head of the army. But Seti recognized the need to project a renewed image of royal power abroad, and was fortunate in possessing the appetite for battle. Sustaining such a policy, however, would lead Egypt ever deeper into the quagmire of international politics, with momentous consequences. The political map of the Near East in Seti's time was radically and irrevocably changed from the confident days of the late 18th dynasty. Under Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, Egypt had achieved a lasting peace with the major power of northern Mesopotamia, the Kingdom of Mitanni, and had secured the new relationship through a series of diplomatic marriages. The two powers had respected each other's spheres of influence and had managed to coexist amicably for half a century. Then, early in the reign of Akhenaten, the accession of a belligerent and ambitious ruler of the Hittites had dealt a body blow to the carefully negotiated balance of power. In a series of swift and devastating campaigns, the Hittite king Shuppiluliuma had succeeded in breaking out of his Anatolian heartland to conquer significant swaths of Mitannian-controlled territory, even raiding the Mitannian capital. Egypt had stuck by its friendship with Mitanni, but the Mesopotamian kingdom was by that time all but a spent force. A new superpower had arrived on the scene, and Egypt had been totally unprepared. Under Akhenaten, the pharaonic government's initial reaction had been not to get involved. This passivity had been a fatal error. The combination of Mitannian weakness and Egyptian hesitancy had then led a number of former vassal states to exploit the power vacuum and push for greater autonomy. Chief among them had been Amurru, a sizable region of central Syria between the river Orontes and the Mediterranean Sea. As we have seen, the ruler of Amurru, Abdi Ashurta, had been a shameless wheeler-dealer, quick to take advantage of political rivalries and social instability to advance his own cause. His missives to the Egyptian court form a significant portion of the Amarna letters archive. Either the Egyptians had not known quite what to make of him, or they'd decided a policy of non-intervention was the most sensible course. Yet this disinterest had merely encouraged Abdi Ashurta in his ambitions, and Amurru had remained outside Egyptian control. Pharaonic power, once feared and respected throughout the Near East, had had no more success with the wayward state of Kadesh. Its rulers had been a thorn in Egypt's side ever since the reign of Thutmose III, and they had stayed true to character during Akhenaten's reign by going over to the enemy's side as soon as the Hittite army had come knocking at their gates. An abortive mission to recapture Kadesh had merely underlined Egypt's weakness. A second attempt on the town during the reign of Tutankhamun had met with similar failure, encouraging the gloating Hittites to consolidate their hold over northern Syria. Aziru of Amurru, Abdi Ashurta's son, seeing which way the wind had been blowing, had joined Kadesh in pledging allegiance to the region's new Hittite overlords. The attempt by Tutankhamun's widow to engineer a diplomatic marriage to a Hittite prince, to save her from Ai's clutches, could have brought about a lasting peace between the two rival powers. Instead, Prince Zenan's mysterious death had merely provided yet another excuse for Hittite expansion. The prince's father had vented his wrath on the treacherous Egyptians by attacking Egyptian-held territory in southern Syria. But the Hittites had not had it all their own way. In a bitter twist of fate, the prisoners of war that had been brought back to the Hittite capital from these punitive raids had carried with them the plague. It had swept through the royal citadel at Hattusa, killing not only the king, but his crown prince as well. It was still ravaging the Hittite homeland. 20 years later, to the Hittites, it must have seemed that the gods had changed sides. To the Egyptians, these bizarre events, far from Home seemed to have rekindled the possibility of victory. An uneasy peace had settled over Syria, with Egypt and the Hittites at a stalemate. So things had stood when Seti I came to the throne. With a soldier's blood in his veins, he was resolute in his determination to restore Egypt's tarnished national pride. After a half-century of inglorious retreat, it was time for Amun-Ra to be on the march once again. Having reasserted Egyptian control over Phoenicia and Canaan, Seti set his sights on Amurru and Kadesh. Winning them back would strike a symbolically powerful blow to Hittite aspirations and would go a long way to reviving Egypt's regional reputation. Just a year after recapturing Beth Shan and Yenom, Seti's army struck deep into central Syria. Kadesh was taken, and a triumphant Seti ordered a magnificent victory inscription to be erected in the city. His elation was to be short-lived. As soon as the Egyptian troops had disappeared over the horizon, the perfidious inhabitants of Kadesh returned at once to the Hittite fold. The pharaoh's forces had rather more success with the province of Amurru. Once retaken, it remained loyal to its new Egyptian master. At the end of the campaign, a large part of central Syria had changed sides. Seti had erased the humiliations of previous generations and had set Egypt back on the path of imperial greatness. Or so he hoped. In fact, the Hittites were merely regrouping. They had no intention of taking these setbacks lying down. Marshalling their considerable forces high on the Anatolian plateau, they prepared for all-out war. As the skies darkened over the Near East, the looming showdown between the two superpowers would not be long in coming. Behind the apparent pluck and resolve of Seti I's foreign policy there lurks a conundrum. If Egypt and the Hittites had indeed agreed on some sort of accommodation during the reign of Horemheb, as later sources suggest, then Seti's bold campaigns drove a coach and horses through it. Moreover, his actions set in train a series of increasingly bloody clashes that led not to the restoration of Egyptian supremacy but to long-term losses. In retrospect, Seti's Asiatic wars look rash and foolish. One possible explanation is that his policy was dictated more by political expediency than by a careful calculation of Egypt's strategic interests. Rulers throughout history have resorted to stoking a foreign conflict to deflect attention from problems closer to home. And, indeed, there are tantalizing clues from early in Seti's reign that may suggest an insecurity at the heart of his regime. In the king's battle reliefs at Ipizit, an enigmatic figure labeled only as the group marshaller and fan-bearer May is depicted with unusual prominence, as if playing a key role in the battles and in Seti's wider offensive strategy. To have been given such high status on a royal monument, May, the name is an abbreviation for an unknown longer name, must have been one of the most influential figures at court, perhaps occupying a position akin to that of Horemheb during the reign of Tutankhamun or of Paramessu during the reign of Horemheb. It has even been suggested that the mysterious May was Seti's designated heir, and that the martial king had decided to follow recent precedent by leaving his throne to a fellow army officer. If so, Seti's son, the adolescent Prince Ramses, had other ideas. Within a few years of May's figure being carved, every instance was systematically erased from the Ipizit reliefs, to be replaced by Ramses's own image. The next generation of the Ramesside dynasty had no intention of allowing a mere commoner to exercise such influence over the kingdom's affairs. Ramses, and he alone, would be recognized by posterity as his father's true heir and most steadfast supporter. Ramses, and he alone, would continue Seti's aggressive foreign policy and fulfill Egypt's destiny as a great imperial power. Ramses, and he alone, would confront the Hittites directly in a final struggle for international supremacy. The pharaoh's army readied itself as the country marched onward to war. Chapter 16. War and Peace. Battle Royal. On a crisp May morning in 1274, shortly after dawn, Ramses II broke camp and rode out at the head of his army. Behind him, in the chill morning air, slowly but surely, the massive expeditionary force of more than 20,000 men inched its way along the dusty track, from the ridgetop vantage point where it had spent the night, down into the Valley below. After a month on the march, from the Egyptian border to Gaza, through the hill country of Canaan to Megiddo, and thence along the Litani and Bekaa valleys, the army's ultimate destination lay just half a day ahead. The great town of Kadesh had been a decisive player in the power politics of the Near East for centuries. Situated in the fertile valley of the river Orontes, it commanded one of the few routes that crossed the coastal range to link inland Syria with the Mediterranean coast. It was thus of vital strategic importance for control of the wider region. 25 centuries later, the Crusaders recognized the same strategic imperative, building the greatest of their castles, Croix des Chevaliers, just a few miles away. Back in the days of Thutmose III, the Prince of Kadesh had been the leader of the rebels vanquished at Megiddo. In more recent times, Kadesh had successfully played the Egyptians and the Hittites off against each other, switching allegiance from one side to the other. The town's canny rulers had also taken impressive steps to defend themselves, while they might have been quite happy to act as agents provocateurs in the looming confrontation between the two great powers. They had no wish to see their homes reduced to rubble in the process. Nestled in a fork of the Orontes and one of its tributaries, Kadesh was naturally protected on three sides by water. By cutting a channel to the south of the town, linking the two rivers, the citizens had turned their town, already heavily fortified, into a virtual island, impregnable against attack. Nonetheless, Ramses had determined to capture Kadesh once and for all, to restore Egypt's imperial reputation in Syria. After a decade of low-level hostilities, the Egyptian and Hittite forces had settled upon Kadesh as the location for a great set-piece battle that would finally decide permanent supremacy over the important territory of Amur, which had switched sides so frequently during the previous decades. So it was with a combination of resolution and anticipation that the pharaoh's army now marched. The massive force assembled by Ramses, representing perhaps 3/4 of Egypt's total military strength, was formed of 4 divisions, each commanded by a senior royal officer. The king himself was in charge of the lead division, named for the god Amun. Behind him followed the divisions of Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Once on the march, the line of troops stretched for more than a mile, weapons glinting in the sunlight, an awesome sight indeed. As the eldest son and successor of the warrior king Seti I, Ramses had learned at his father's side the art of military leadership, and he knew that the sight of him triumphantly arrayed in his golden chariot would both inspire his own troops and strike fear into the heart of the enemy. Indeed, initial reports from the field suggested that the Hittites had taken fright as the division of Amun marched through dense woods on the south bank of the Orontes. Egyptian scouts intercepted 2 Bedouin tribesmen. Their interrogation yielded astonishing and welcome news. The Hittite army, overawed by Ramses's resolve and his fearsome war machine, was keeping its distance and was currently 120 miles away. In the land of Aleppo, fearing deliberate misinformation, the Egyptians cross-questioned the nomads, but they stuck to their story. Everything seemed to be going Ramses's way. Buoyed by this unexpected turn of events, the army pressed on toward Kadesh. Once out of the woods, the division of Amun forded the Orontes near the village of Shaptuna, modern Riblah, and after another 3 hours marching reached their campsite opposite Kadesh. The site was well chosen, with a nearby brook affording welcome refreshment for men and horses alike. While the animals quenched their thirst, the soldiers began to pitch camp. Chariots were parked, tents erected, and shields set up to form a defensive laager. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hazy in the distance, the fortress-like Kadesh dominated the southeastern horizon. As soon as Ramses and his forward division reached the campsite, the intelligence corps dispatched scouts into the surrounding countryside, following established practice, to reconnoiter the land and provide information about enemy movements. Almost immediately, they stumbled upon 2 Hittite spies engaged in similar activities. It was a stroke of extraordinary luck, the first of several strokes that spring afternoon. The enemy agents were subjected not to a mild interrogation but to fierce beatings. What they revealed under torture was a bombshell. far from being 120 miles away in Cheryev. Battle, the Hittite king Muhammad Ali II and his forces were at that very moment camped behind Kadesh, the town mound concealing their presence from the Egyptians. Moreover, the Hittite commanders had decided to launch a preemptive strike against the Egyptian army and were preparing to attack at any moment. Having spilled their terrible news, the spies were dragged before an astonished Ramses, who erupted in fury. He slammed his senior officers for their incompetence and, taking personal charge of events, ordered urgent emergency measures. The royal princes traveling with the king were sent immediately out of danger, fleeing westward, away from the oncoming storm. The vizier was dispatched southward at full speed, to hurry the advance of the division of Ptah, which was only now preparing to ford the Orontes. The message from Ramses was desperate: His Majesty is all alone. 1 minutes later, the attack came. A huge detachment of 2,500 Hittite chariots, their warriors fearsome in ankle-length mail coats, swept across the river and struck the division of Ra as it was marching northward toward the Egyptian camp. Unlike the Egyptian battle chariots, which were essentially mobile firing platforms, the Hittite chariots were sturdy war machines. Each carried not 2 but 3 crew, a driver and 2 soldiers, armed with stabbing spears. For close-range combat, used en masse, in an organized charge, the Hittite chariotry was devastatingly effective at demolishing ranks of enemy infantry, as the division of Ra now discovered, to its great cost. With their dead and dying comrades littering the ground, the surviving Egyptian soldiers panicked and fled headlong toward their camp, the Hittites in hot pursuit. Within moments, the enemy was at the gate. Chariots charged through the unfinished wall of shields to attack the Egyptian generals in their tented headquarters. It was pandemonium. With no time to think, Ramses acted instinctively, leaping onto his chariot and swinging into action against the Hittite foe. The king was surrounded by his elite bodyguard of Aegean mercenaries, fierce fighting men from the coasts and islands on the western fringes of the Hittite Empire, men whose bravery and resilience had impressed the great powers of the Near East in recent decades. They, not the Nubians of old, were now the hired hands of choice for an Egyptian army. With them at his side, Ramses darted between his attackers and showed his mastery of the bow and arrow, holding the fort, quite literally, amid chaos and confusion. It would take a miracle to withstand the Hittite onslaught for very long. But then, as if in answer to Ramses's desperate prayers, help arrived in the nick of time. It was not a miracle but the result of the Egyptians' tactical genius. While the main Egyptian army had marched overland to Kadesh, a reserve force of elite warriors had been sent by sea, up the Phoenician coast. Its instructions were to land at the Syrian port of Sumer and cut inland via the Eleutherus, modern Nahr el-Kabir, valley to link up with Ramses at Kadesh on the day of his arrival. They had done exactly as instructed. As the elite charioteers appeared in a cloud of dust on the horizon, the pharaoh knew help was at hand. Their resolve stiffened by the sudden reinforcements. The Egyptians forced the Hittites to withdraw and made to press home their advantage. Muhammad Ali, observing the reversal of fortune from a safe distance, sent a second wave of his chariots into the fray. These too were repulsed, and an Egyptian countercharge succeeded in pushing the enemy back toward the Orontes. After falling into the river, many Hittite charioteers were drowned or swept away. Others barely managed to scramble to safety. On the opposite bank, the Prince of Aleppo, one of Muhammad Ali's chief lieutenants, was hauled by his men from the bloody waters, barely alive. The Hittites' surprise attack had rebounded on them. In a matter of minutes, a certain victory had turned into an ignominious retreat. As dusk approached, the Egyptian division of Ptah finally arrived on the scene, in time to round up the surviving Hittite soldiers, make a tally of the enemy dead, and collect the booty abandoned on the battlefield. Egyptian survivors of the carnage limped to their camp, followed, just before nightfall, by the 4th and final Army Division of Seth. On both sides, it was time to take stock and count the cost. For the Egyptians, dreadful losses on the battlefield had been matched by an equally Devastating loss of reputation, their very survival had been in peril, and only the king's personal charisma, combined with the timely arrival of the reserve force, had prevented the army's total annihilation. For the Hittites, the scene was equally bleak. King Muwatalli had lost two of his own brothers in the fighting, together with his secretary, the chief of his bodyguard, 4 leading charioteers, and numerous officers. With neither side victorious, the Battle of Kadesh was not over yet. At daybreak, after a fitful night tending the wounded and repairing mangled chariots, the two armies met once more, this time for the planned encounter on the plain in front of Kadesh. Yet the previous day's fighting had fatally weakened both sides. The Egyptians had sustained heavy losses and could not overcome the might of the Hittite infantry. It had sat out the initial assault, and was thus rested and resolute. The Hittites, having lost a sizable proportion of their chariotry, could not inflict a decisive defeat on the Egyptians. After several hours of bloody battle, with no breakthrough in sight, Ramses withdrew his forces from the field. He realized he would never succeed in his strategic objective of capturing Kadesh, let alone in defeating the Hittites. Muwatalli, too, realized he could not orchestrate a decisive victory. He sued for peace and sent an envoy to the Egyptian camp with terms for a ceasefire. Ramses had little option but to accept them. 24 hours after arriving at Kadesh, the Egyptians gathered up their materiel and marched homeward. After 2 months away, Ramses's once mighty army arrived back in the green fields of the Nile Delta in late June, exhausted and despondent. Yet the king himself seems to have drawn strength from the bruising encounter, not least his own role in saving the day for Egypt. He had snatched, if not victory, then at least survival from the jaws of defeat, and felt ever more certain of his destiny. In keeping with his supremely self-assured, not to say megalomaniac, character, Ramses now proceeded to turn the whole Kadesh episode to his advantage. In a carefully orchestrated barrage of propaganda, comprising both art and literature, the king broadcast his version of events throughout Egypt. He had the country's finest writers compose a factual prose account of the battle alongside an epic poem, both designed to celebrate the king's great victory over the Hittites. The texts were inscribed on temple walls and were, no doubt, recited triumphantly and frequently at court. To complement these literary paeans, Ramses commissioned his artists to devise a stock set of pictorial scenes to capture the main moments of the battle. Chief among these tableaus, of course, was the oversized figure of the valorous monarch, all alone in the Egyptian camp, fending off the enemy single-handedly. So pleased was the king with the result that he had the same series of images carved on the facades of at least 5 major temples. Poems and pictures, both allowed Ramses to contrast the incompetence and vacillation of his senior military officers with his own foresight and ability to be cool-headed under fire. For a king whose birthright could have been threatened by an army insider, this must have been the sweetest revenge. For modern scholars, the images and words furnish an extraordinary amount of detail, and make the Battle of Kadesh the best known military encounter in the ancient world. For Ramses's contemporaries, however, the accounts announced a return to the vainglorious and bombastic kingship of old. After the heresy of Akhenaten, the ephemeral reigns of his immediate successors, and the military junta of Horemheb and the early Ramessides, a resplendent and triumphalist monarchy was back with a vengeance. Even if the truth had to suffer in the process. King of Kings. While stalemate at Kadesh had singularly failed to advance Ramses II's strategic aims, the standoff and cessation of hostilities did at least allow him to reap a peace dividend. Resources that might have been expended on foreign military adventures could instead be invested in projects at home. In the first 2 decades of his reign, 1279 to 1259, Ramses commissioned major new temple buildings throughout his realm, from the Lebanese port of Kabni to Gabel Barkal, in distant Sudan. The king seems to have had a particular preoccupation with Egyptian-controlled Nubia, ordering the construction of new shrines at 7 different sites. In Egypt proper, architects and masons made Impressive additions to the great national temples at Ayunu and Heracleopolis, Abju, and Thebes. Today, more standing monuments bear the names of Ramses II than of any other pharaoh. By a combination of construction and appropriation, taking pains to have his cartouche sized so deeply into the stone that it could never be removed, Ramses ensured that his name would live forever. He seems to have been driven by a deep desire to surpass all his predecessors, and by a resolute sense of his own uniqueness. One of the king's favorite myths about himself told how the seven Hathors, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the Fates, had watched over his infant cradle and devised an extraordinary destiny for him while he was still a babe in arms. Whether this reveals a thoroughgoing monomania or a pathological inferiority complex is open to debate. What is certain is that Ramses's building projects were characterized more by sheer size and brute strength than by any more refined aesthetic. Only in the exquisite decoration of the Theban tomb prepared for his beloved wife Nefertari did Ramses allow his craftsmen to give free rein to their artistic sensibilities. To supply so many simultaneous building projects with the necessary quantities of stone was beyond even Egypt's prodigious quarrying capacity. So Ramses resorted to the age-old expedient of demolishing his forebears' monuments and requisitioning their stone for his own purposes. The chief victims of this wholesale plunder were the temples built by Akhenaten at Thebes and Akhetaten. The small, regular stone blocks that had enabled the heretic king to build his monuments so rapidly now contributed to the monument's equally swift demise. Blocks by the thousand were taken from the Aten temples too facilitate the erection of new shrines to the old gods. Ramses was thus able to kill two birds with one stone, cleansing the land of Akhenaten's heresy and promoting himself as the champion of Egypt's traditional deities. Since the reign of Amenhotep III 90 years earlier, the greatest stage for the ceremonies of divine kingship had been Luxor Temple, with its gigantic colonnade hall and beautiful open-air courtyard, providing a spectacular backdrop to the mysteries of the annual Opet festival. The temptation to make it yet grander proved irresistible to Ramses. He added an entire new court and colossal gateway to the temple, decorated with massive scenes of his triumph at the Battle of Kadesh. Never shy of improving the monuments of his predecessors, he did not hesitate to change the main axis of Luxor Temple in order to line it up better with Ipizit and provide a more coherent processional route. Finally, to adorn the new facade of Luxor, Ramses had installed what would become his trademark, a pair of colossal seated statues of himself, in this case complemented by a pair of towering obelisks. Spectacle, it seems, was all. Nowhere is Ramses's taste for the theatrical and self-reverential better demonstrated than in the temple of Ramses beloved of Amun, modern Abu Simbel, in Lower Nubia. The sheer rock face of a sacred mountain, towering over the Nile just north of the second cataract, was the chosen setting for the king's most remarkable and vainglorious project. The smaller of two temples was officially dedicated to the mother goddess and royal protectress Hathor. Inside, on the back wall of the sanctuary, the Hathor cow is shown emerging from the primeval papyrus swamp, protecting the king in her embrace. Outside, all pretense of piety is dropped, and the decoration concentrates on the king's great wife Nefertari and her doting husband. On either side of the doorway, a standing statue of the queen is flanked by two colossi of Ramses, 30 feet high. The larger temple develops this theme further, statues and reliefs of Ramses dominating the interior and exterior. The facade is formed by four vast seated statues of the king, each measuring nearly 70 feet high. On the pedestal, the king's name is shown above rows of foreign captives, emphasizing his mastery of all peoples. Inside the temple, scenes depict Ramses killing the enemies of Egypt and presenting them to the gods, who naturally include his deified self. Indeed, Ramses's apotheosis is the dominant theme at Abu Simbel. In desolate, conquered Nubia, where the gods were not watching, the king could give his megalomania free rein. The true scale of the king's self-aggrandizement is revealed in the innermost parts of Abu Simbel. Beyond the pillared hall, each pillar adorned with a colossal standing statue of Ramses in the guise of Osiris, and the ubiquitous depictions of the Battle of Kadesh lies the Holy of Holies, deep inside the mountain. This intimate space is dominated by the statues of Egypt's four chief gods, carved from the living rock. Permanently in the shadows, to one side, sits Ptah, Thonik, creator god of Memphis. Next to him are Amun, creator god of Thebes, Ra-Horakhti, the solar deity who combined Ra and Horus, and the deified Ramses. In his mind and in his monuments, the king was the equal of Egypt's most ancient and revered deities. Moreover, on 2 days a year, February 21st and November 21st, one of them, presumably Ramses II's birthday, the first rays of the rising sun penetrated the entrance of the temple and illuminated the statues in the sanctuary, bringing them to life. It must have been a stunning spectacle. Few autocrats in human history have conceived a more dramatic expression of their personality cult. After Ipizit, Luxor, and Abu Simbel, Ramses's greatest project was his own mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The most ambitious monument of its kind since the reign of Amenhotep III, Ramses united with Thebes, known today as the Ramesseum, covered an area of more than 11.5 acres. Quite unashamedly, every inch of the temple was given over to texts, reliefs, and statuary celebrating the king. Beyond the first great gateway, decorated with scenes of the Battle of Kadesh, the first courtyard was dominated by a series of huge pillars along the north side, each of which had a gigantic statue of Ramses in front of it. Facing them, on the south side, was a portico and balcony, where the king could appear to his loyal followers on high days and holidays. Beyond a second gateway, bearing yet more battle reliefs, lay a second court, likewise adorned with colossal statues of Ramses. Dwarfing even these, a vast granite colossus once stood next to the second gateway, until an earthquake felled it in antiquity. It shattered remains, carved deeply with the king's throne name, Usermatra, corrupted to Ozymandias in Greek, inspired the most famous critique of absolute power in the English language. The Ramesseum, perhaps more than any other monument, summed up its owner's unrivaled status not just in spiritual but also in temporal matters. Surrounding the temple on all sides, vast storerooms and granaries provided storage for a significant part of Egypt's wealth. It would have taken 350 boatloads, 250,000 sacks, of grain to fill the granaries completely, enough to support the inhabitants of a medium-sized city, such as Thebes, for a year. In effect, the Ramesseum acted as Upper Egypt's reserve bank. Both practically and symbolically, the nation's wealth was under royal control. With such vast resources at his disposal, Ramses could afford to indulge his obsession with monumentality, from the vast colossi of Abu Simbel to the majestic courts of Thebes. Well might he have uttered the immortal words of Shelley's poem, "House proud." Not content with erecting temples and usurping monuments throughout the length and breadth of Egypt, Ramses II created an architectural wonder on an even greater scale, one that is now entirely lost from sight. His father, Seti I, had built a small summer palace near the old Hyksos capital of Hutware, where the Ramesside royal family had its origins. The young Ramses must have spent time there, preparing for battle, and as king he set about transforming it into something altogether grander. In 2 decades of non-stop construction, a vast series of mansions, halls, offices, and barracks grew up around the royal palace, until Ramses had created an entirely new city, a dynastic capital equal in splendor to Memphis or Thebes. With customary chutzpah, he named it per Ramses, the house of Ep. Ramses. A desirable residence it certainly was, with vast living quarters and administrative districts full of palaces, temples, and public buildings. The surrounding countryside was some of the most productive in Egypt, supplying fruit, vegetables, and wine, and providing pasture for great herds of cattle. Scribes wrote wondrously of canals filled with fish, marshlands teeming with waterfowl, fields abundant with green pasture, and granaries overflowing with barley and wheat. The royal quarter, covering 4 square miles, was located in a natural stronghold. On the banks of the Nile, protected by canals and sand promontories. Court poets penned eulogies on the splendor of Ramses's palaces, describing pillared halls and decoration of unparalleled richness. Walls, floors, columns, and doorways, all were encrusted with polychrome tile work, depicting rivers and gardens, heraldic motifs, and foreign captives. The steps leading to the throne dais were adorned with prostrate images of the king's enemies, so that he might tread them underfoot each time he ascended or descended. If the royal residence was dazzling, the elite quarter in the suburbs was scarcely less so. The area favored by Ramses's wealthiest citizens resembled a Venetian idyll, with canals, large villas, and water gardens. The center of the city was dominated by a vast temple, dedicated to the Divine Trinity, Amun-Ra-Horakhti-Atum. Fronted by 4 colossal statues of the king, it rivaled Ipizid in size and splendor. The 4 cardinal points of the city were placed under the symbolic protection of other major deities. In the south was the Temple of Seth, Lord of Hutware, dating back to Hyksos times. In the north, a shrine was built to honor the ancient cobra goddess of the delta, Wadjet. In the west, a temple celebrated Amun of Thebes. Finally, in the east, pointing the way to Egypt's empire in the Near East, a sanctuary was dedicated to Astarte, not an Egyptian deity at all but the Syrian goddess of love and war, appropriated into the Egyptian pantheon and given the special role of protecting the horse team that drew the royal chariot. Even by the standards of New Kingdom Egypt, Ramses was a cosmopolitan city. As well as a temple to an Asiatic deity, there were overseas legations and entire quarters for foreign mercenaries. The markets and wharfs played host to merchants from throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. With its geographic proximity to Palestine, Ramses must have been a magnet for immigrants seeking a better life, and it is against such a background that the Bible story of the Exodus came to be written. Exodus 1:11 tells how Pharaoh put the enslaved Hebrews to work on 2 great store cities, Pitom and Ramses. Pitom, or Piratum, has been identified as modern Tel El Maskuta, in the eastern delta, only a day's journey from Ramses, while Ramses can be none other than the new dynastic capital itself. It is highly likely that Semitic-speaking laborers were employed in the construction of the city, but they were more likely migrant workers rather than slaves, although the working conditions may have made the distinction somewhat academic. As for any exodus of Hebrews, in the reign of Ramses II or later, the ancient Egyptian sources are silent. The story may therefore have been a conflation of several unrelated historical events. On the other hand, as we have seen, Ramses was not one to let the truth stand in the way of his news agenda. While the court scribes and poets lauded Ramses as a great royal residence, filled with exuberance and joy, there was also a more menacing side to this most ambitious of royal projects. One of the largest buildings was a vast bronze smelting factory whose hundreds of workers spent their days making armaments. State-of-the-art high-temperature furnaces were heated by blast pipes worked by bellows. As the molten metal came out, sweating laborers poured it into molds for shields and swords. In dirty, hot, and dangerous conditions, the pharaoh's people made the weapons for the pharaoh's army. Another large area of the city was given over to stables, exercise grounds, and repair works for the king's chariot corps. The royal stud farm provided accommodation for at least 460 horses together with their trainers and grooms. The animals were exercised in a wide, pillared court, while nearby workshops produced and repaired the tack. In short, Ramses was less pleasure dome and more military-industrial complex. The city's very foundation had been prompted by an upsurge in military activity in the Near East. It was from here that Ramses set out for Kadesh, to hear that he returned, bloodied but unbowed. For all its pleasures and palaces, Ramses, with its polyglot population, must have been a constant reminder of the king's unfinished business in Syria-Palestine. Despite having the largest chariot corps in the entire region, Ramses remained unable to neutralize the Hittite threat. Yet as he sat in his riverside palace, smarting with frustration, the king could have little imagined that events hundreds of miles away, were about to deal him the luckiest of hands. Peace in our time. The indecisive Battle of Kadesh had been followed by a decade of Cold War, with the Hittites and the Egyptians facing off against each other, neither able to achieve hegemony. But the two old rivals were no longer the only powers in the region. Beyond the Euphrates, the kingdom of Assyria was in the ascendant, barely a year after Kadesh. And emboldened by the Hittites' failure to prevail, an Assyrian army attacked the crucial Hittite ally of Hanagalbot, the remnants of the old Mitannian kingdom, and made it their vassal. It was a warning shot. Neither the Hittites nor, for that matter, the Egyptians could afford to ignore. Ramses launched a series of low-level campaigns in the Near East, determined to shore up Egyptian control over its imperial provinces, to crush opportunistic rebellions that had broken out in the aftermath of Kadesh, and to show the Assyrians that Egypt was still a force to be reckoned with. Having overcome dissidents in the hills of Galilee, and having recaptured the important port of Akko, Ramses could not restrain his bravado and advanced into the erstwhile Egyptian territory of Amurru, now back within the Hittite fold. First one and then another city-state fell to the pharaoh's army, until Ramses occupied the middle Orontes Valley, effectively bisecting the Hittites' southernmost province. It looked as if this rash maneuver might provoke another all-out war, but the sudden death of the Hittite king Muwatalli plunged Egypt's enemy into a succession crisis, with major repercussions. Muwatalli had left the throne to his young son, Prince Uritshep, who duly succeeded as king. But the new monarch's uncle, Hattusili, had other ideas. Before long, two rival courts had developed and the ruling elite was riven by divided loyalties. After much bitter infighting, Hattusili prevailed and Uritshep fled to Egypt, seeking sanctuary at the court of Ramses II, the pharaoh, who had been watching all these developments from a safe distance, could hardly believe his luck. In his protracted struggle for supremacy with the Hittites, fate had now delivered him, quite unexpectedly, the ultimate bargaining chip. No sooner had Uritshep fled to Egypt than Hattusili demanded his immediate extradition. Ramses refused and put his troops in Syria on high alert, in case the Hittites attacked. But his diplomatic antennae suggested such a course of events was unlikely, for a new ruler had just come to power in Assyria with imperialist ambitions of his own. Ramses calculated, correctly, that the Hittites would be too preoccupied with this threat to their eastern flank to reopen hostilities with Egypt. When the Assyrians invaded Hanagalbot for a second time and liquidated it as a separate territory, the Hittites suddenly found themselves in greater danger than ever before. Only the river Euphrates separated their kingdom from the belligerent and expansionist Assyria. It was time to put national security before national pride. An alliance with Assyria was unthinkable, so Hattusili put out discreet feelers in Egypt's direction, to explore the possibilities of peace with Ramses. After a year of fraught negotiations, accompanied by much shuttle diplomacy, the details of a treaty were hammered out. So, in early December 1259, a decade and a half after the Battle of Kadesh, a high-level delegation set out from the Hittite capital of Hattusa, high on the Anatolian plateau, bound for Ramses. Alongside the Hittite envoys traveled a representative from Carchemish, the Hittites' forward base on the banks of the Euphrates. It was a clear indication that cordial relations with Egypt now lay at the heart of Hittite foreign and security policy. After a month traveling the dusty roads of the Near East, the envoys finally arrived in the great Delta city and were ushered into the royal audience chamber. Bowing low before Ramses, the chief Hittite representative presented a great silver tablet, engraved in wedge-shaped cuneiform writing. It was a gift from Hattusili himself, a copy of the comprehensive treaty that from now on would bind the Egyptians and the Hittites in mutual support and friendship. Never to be outdone, Ramses had the Egyptian version of the treaty engraved on the walls of Ipizit, to stand as a perpetual record of his diplomatic skill. And a remarkable document it was, in either language. After declaring a formal end to hostilities between the two kingdoms, the text celebrated the establishment of friendly relations. The elements of this new relationship were far-sighted and wide-ranging: a mutual non-aggression pact, a defensive alliance, an extradition agreement, together with the promise of humane treatment for those extradited, an amnesty for refugees, and, last but by no means least, a clause to safeguard the royal succession and the rights of the monarchy in both kingdoms. With the deposed Uritshep still on the loose in Egypt, this final measure was a precondition for Hattusili, for it guaranteed his claim to the Hittite kingship and the rights of his heirs. It also played to Ramses's dynastic concerns, reflected in his radical decision to promote his many sons to high office, the first time for 1,000 years that such a policy had been adopted. For Hittites and Egyptians alike, honor was thus served, and both sides could claim victory. Egypt reluctantly gave up all hope of winning back Amurru, but kept its other Asiatic province up, and confirmed its trading rights in the Lebanese and Syrian ports, as far north as Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra. With the signing of the treaty, the Near East regained a peace not seen since the heady days of the Egypt-Mitanni alliance during the reign of Amenhotep III. From implacable enemies to the best of friends, Hattusili and Ramses celebrated the transformation in their relationship with an exchange of congratulatory correspondence. Their wives, too, joined in the love fest, Ramses's chief consort, Nefertari, sending expensive jewelry and clothes to her sister in Hattusa. The only sour note was the continued presence of Uritshep in Egypt, but Hattusili could not afford to let this spoil the otherwise friendly relations. Indeed, things were going so well between the two rulers that negotiations were opened regarding the possibility of a diplomatic marriage. For Hattusili and his equally forceful wife Pudukhepa, the marriage of their daughter to the great king of Egypt would serve to strengthen the links between the two royal houses and bolster their own position. Ramses, by contrast, secure on his throne, was principally interested in the enormous dowry that would accompany the Hittite princess. With a beloved Egyptian wife of his own, he showed little personal interest in the bride-to-be. For him it was a transaction, not a marriage. Whatever misgivings she may have had, the Hittite princess had no choice in the matter, and, in the late autumn of 1246, she set out from the fortified citadel of the Hittite kings. Accompanying her were a great retinue of officials and a vast baggage train of gold, silver, bronze, slaves, horses, cattle, and goats. The procession wound its way slowly through the passes of the Taurus Mountains down into the coastal lowlands of southern Anatolia, then over the Amanus range to the plain of Aleppo, and thence southward, following the valley of the river Orontes, past Kadesh, to the border of Egyptian-held territory. At the frontier, Queen Pudukhepa bade farewell to her daughter for the last time. A messenger was dispatched to Ramses to tell the waiting pharaoh, "They have traversed sheer mountains and treacherous passes to reach your majesty's border." 3 Ramses immediately dispatched members of his army and officials to meet the cavalcade and escort it through Canaan, the last stop before Egypt itself was a specially built royal palace astride the Sinai coastal road, PYYP, in which the princess and her attendants could rest and recuperate after their long journey. The brightly colored paintings of flowers and garlands, ornamented with gold leaf, offered a taste of things to come. In February 1245, 3 months after leaving Hattusa, the procession entered the dazzling city of Ramses amid scenes of jubilation. After taking delivery of the dowry, Ramses conferred on his new bride a suitably grandiloquent Egyptian name, Mothorneferura. She sees, in Horus, that is, the king, the beauty of Ra, and then promptly packed her off to one of his harem palaces. Job done. A few years later, the princess's brother, Crown Prince Hishmi-Sheruma, paid a formal visit to Egypt, spending the winter months in the relatively balmy climate of the eastern delta, a welcome relief from the windswept wastes of his homeland. For a man accustomed to the austere buildings of Hattusa, the gaudy decoration of Ramses must have made a lasting impression. Indeed, when he eventually became king, Hishmi-Sheruma adorned the sanctuaries of his realm with monumental religious art on a scale far greater than any of his predecessors. Even a Hittite, it seems, could fall under Egypt's unique spell. The crown prince's visit may have been intended to pave the way for an even higher level encounter, a full-scale summit between Hattusili and Ramses. A flurry of correspondence between the two capitals certainly discussed the practicalities of such a meeting, and the pharaoh expressed the hope that he and his Hittite counterpart would see each other face to face. The bond of friendship between the two lands was stronger than ever, and would last until the very end of the Hittite kingdom. New foes for old. Throughout his long 67-year reign, 1279 to 1213, Ramses II gave a high priority to securing Egypt's imperial possessions in the Near East and neutralizing the Hittite threat. At the same time, his security apparatus was alert to another growing danger, not from the north but from the west. The semi-nomadic tribes of the Libyan desert and their settled kinsmen along the coast had been a persistent irritant since the earliest days of the First Dynasty. A punitive raid or two had always been sufficient to keep them in check and prevent large-scale infiltration of the western delta. But things had changed. Almost nothing is known about the history and archaeology of Libya before the arrival of the Phoenicians in the 8th century BC, but from references in Egyptian sources it is clear that an advanced civilization had developed by Ramesside times, at least along the North African coast. Imported artifacts point to close trade links across the Mediterranean with the Mycenaeans, who some 2 centuries earlier had displaced the Minoans as the main Aegean power. The ships that docked at Libyan coastal harbors brought with them great wealth, boosting the local economy and providing the chiefs with unprecedented resources. From long service as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, the Libyans had also learned a thing or two about modern warfare, acquiring the chariot and gaining considerable skill with the bow and arrow. By late in the reign of Ramses II, the Libyan tribal rulers had gathered both the financial means and the technology to confront Egypt on equal terms. For the pharaoh, it was a deeply unwelcome prospect. Ramses's instinctive response was to fortify the entire Libyan frontier. His defensive system comprised a series of massive fortresses, built at roughly 50-mile intervals the length of the western delta border. Each fort was within a day's chariot ride of its neighbor, and only a couple of days' ride from Ramses. Not only did the forts guard the coastal approaches to the delta, but they also enclosed all the major wells in the area, thus denying fresh water to any hostile force. One of the larger forts was even provided with its own temple, to inspire the garrison to feats of courage. In a typically Ramesside gesture, the temple was dedicated to the cult of the deified king. The pharaoh's western wall did its job for a time, and the Libyans failed to break through the line while Ramses was on the throne. But in the aftermath of his death and the unexpected succession of his 13th son, Meremta, the 12 older sons having predeceased their octogenarian father, the impatient tribal rulers saw their chance. In 1209, the 5th year of the new king's reign, and the vile enemy had done his homework. Utilizing a wide range of strategic alliances, he had contrived a simultaneous revolt in Nubia, to distract Egypt's southern garrisons, and had augmented his own Libyan army with a large detachment of mercenaries from the Aegean and beyond, northerners who came from all lands. These sea peoples, pirates and raiders in search of plunder and conquest, brought with them an entirely new type of warfare, based upon heavy infantry deploying close combat weapons, small round shields, and body armor. Massed ranks of such well-armed opponents rendered ineffective the chariotry upon which Egypt and the other great powers of the Near East had depended for their military supremacy. Like the Libyans, some of the sea peoples had previously served in the Egyptian army. Aegean mercenaries had made up Ramses II's bodyguard at the Battle of Kadesh, and so knew their enemies' strengths and weaknesses. Mary's battle strategy was based on the simple expedient of divide and rule. If he could attack Egypt on several fronts simultaneously, causing confusion and disrupting lines of communication, he and his forces might hope to prevail. So, after sending a small raiding party along the coast to keep the border garrisons busy, he and the main assault force set off toward Egypt via the oases of the western desert, Siwa, Bahr Aya, and Farafra. The last oasis commanded a network of Desert routes that join the Nile Valley at different points, so by basing his army here, Mary kept the Egyptians guessing about his ultimate intentions. When he was ready, and sure that the Nubian attack was proceeding as planned, the Libyan chief marched on Egypt in a pincer movement, to prevent a unified counterattack. He led the main force from Farafra, back to Bahr Aya, and thence to the Fayum, entering the Nile Valley near the Pyramids of Dahshur. From there, they headed due north, to the fringes of the western delta. A second detachment left the main army at Bahr Aya to cross the Nile in middle Egypt and infiltrate the eastern delta, distracting the Egyptian garrisons at Ramses and Memphis. Just a month after receiving the first news of the Libyan invasion, the pharaoh Meremptah arrived with his army near the town of Pyramids to engage the foe. It was midsummer, 1208. Just as Ramses had fought his toughest battle in the 5th year of his reign, so now his son and successor faced the same challenge. This time, however, the Egyptians were leaving nothing to chance. If the Libyans and sea peoples understood the Egyptians' tactics, the reverse was also true. Meremptah knew that his archers and chariots could not overcome the massed ranks of the enemy infantry in a head-on fight. Instead, he cleverly drew the opposing forces toward the Egyptian lines while archers positioned on either flank directed volley after volley of raking fire against the advancing soldiers. After 6 hours of carnage, the Libyan coalition was finished. Then came the Egyptian chariot charge, turning defeat into rout and pursuing the fleeing enemy until all were either dead or captured. The booty was considerable, thousands of metal vessels, livestock, and advanced weaponry. To press home his victory and send a powerful message to other would-be attackers, Meremptah ordered a grim piece of psychological warfare. The defeated Libyans who had survived the battle soon wished they had perished at Pyramids, for they were herded together and impaled alive on stakes. By the end of the day, fly-blown corpses, their entrails sticky and putrid in the summer heat, lined the main desert route south of Memphis, in full view of any retreating Libyans and of the local populace. It was a grim warning, but even so barbarous a display could not keep Egypt safe for long. Meremptah knew the Libyans would attack again, as they surely did, just 3 years later. He knew, too, that their co-conspirators, the Sea Peoples, might arrive at any time, and from almost any direction. So he pursued his own grand strategy, reinforcing Ugarit, sending grain to the Hittites to bolster the northern defenses, and even integrating Hittite infantry into the Egyptian army. The soldiers were supplied with their own distinctive weaponry from the bronze furnaces of Ramses. The old enmities of Kadesh were but a distant memory. In the unsettling new world of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt needed all the friends it could muster. The commemorative inscription commissioned by Meremptah to celebrate his second victory over the Libyans, 3 years after Pyramids, is famous today not for the details of the battle, nor for the other elements of his defensive strategy, but for a single, fleeting reference. In the penultimate line, after defeating the Western invaders, the Egyptian army marched straight across the delta and into Palestine, recapturing the key towns of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yenom. 2. Complete the job and impose security over this key buffer zone, Meremptah's forces proceeded to massacre a previously unknown rebel tribe in the hill country of Canaan. The tribe called itself Israel. It is the only reference to Israel in any ancient Egyptian inscription, and it reflects the rise of well-armed bands that, despite being unable to defeat the Egyptians in a pitched battle, could nonetheless pose a serious threat to stability. Israel should have been a headline, not a footnote. The whole of the Near East was in flux. The old certainties were crumbling, new peoples and polities were in the ascendant, new forms of warfare were tipping the balance of power. Despite its glorious military history and its dynasty of warrior pharaohs, Egypt faced a deeply uncertain future. Chapter 17. Triumph and Tragedy. Disunited Kingdom. In an absolute monarchy, a long reign could prove a mixed blessing. While too rapid a succession of kings could undermine the divine pretensions of the institution and weaken the administration, an Extended period of office posed the equal dangers of decadence and atrophy. Ramses II's extraordinary reign of 67 years certainly had its positive and negative effects on the government of Egypt. On the plus side, the king's determination and charisma enabled him to restore Egypt's reputation as an imperial power, while the plethora of monuments erected during his reign testified to the country's renewed confidence and prosperity. On the downside, Ramses's longevity combined with his extraordinary fecundity, he fathered at least 50 sons and as many daughters, sowed the seeds for major problems in the royal succession in the following decades. Although Merempta's status as the oldest surviving son could scarcely be doubted, and his reign, 1213 to 1204, therefore passed in relative stability, no sooner had he died than any number of royal grandchildren came forward to claim the throne. Ramses II had been determined to re-establish a dynastic model of monarchy after the haphazard succession of the post-Akhenaten era, and had therefore broken with centuries of tradition by granting his many sons influential positions in government. Little wonder that they came to regard themselves as powers in the land, and that their offspring saw the throne as a legitimate goal. It was no surprise that a major dispute broke out in the senior ranks of the royal family at Merempta's death in 1204, with two rival claimants attempting to seize control. On one side there was Merempta's eldest son and appointed heir, Seti Merempta. Against him stood another of Ramses II's many grandsons, Amenmese. Despite the age-old principle of primogeniture, it was Amenmese, not Seti Merempta, who initially gained the upper hand. He was clearly able to call upon friends in high places, and may even have had a significant section of the army behind him. Amenmese managed to rule for 4 years, 1204 to 1200, while Seti Merempta sweated it out in some far-flung royal palace, an internal exile in his own kingdom. But the usurper did not have it his own way for long. The balance of power eventually swung back to the legitimate claimant, and Seti Merempta was finally able to succeed to his birthright as King Seti II. The purge began at once. A number of prominent officials who had held office under Amenmese immediately lost their jobs. Included were two of the highest-ranking men in the kingdom, the high priest of Amun and the vizier. They had backed the wrong man, and now they paid the price. Proscriptions and dismissals swept through the corridors of power, temporarily crippling the administration as Seti removed anyone and everyone who had supported his rival. Nor did he look any more kindly on Amenmese himself, despite the fact that the two men were first cousins. Every reference to the usurper was ruthlessly expunged. On statues and temple reliefs, the name of Amenmese was excised and replaced with that of Seti. Since a lasting name ensured immortality, the opposite spelled annihilation. For an Egyptian there could be no worse fate. Like his father, Merempta, before him, Seti II was already an old man when he became king, and he was only too aware that he had but a short time to make his mark. The royal quarrymen, masons, and architects went into overdrive as the king sought to leave his legacy in the sacred landscape of Thebes. On the east bank, at Ipizit, builders began erecting a 3-chambered chapel for the sacred bark shrines of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. It might have been small and insignificant compared to the great columned hall of Seti I and Ramses II, but it was a monument of sorts, better than nothing. Over on the west bank, the workmen in the Valley of the Kings had never known such a fever of activity as they set to work excavating and decorating not one but 3 tombs simultaneously, one for Seti, one for his wife Toosret, and one for his favored chancellor, Bey. With no expansion in the workforce, the pressure was immense, and the valley echoed non-stop with the chisels, shouts, and expletives of the men. It is not surprising that the workmanship was distinctly shoddy. Time was not on Seti's side. After just 2 years on his hard-won throne, he went the way of his father and grandfather before him, to join the royal ancestors in the glorious afterlife. His intended heir, a second Seti Merempta, was either already dead or unable to assert his rights to the succession. Instead, with the backing of Chancellor Bey, a fickle friend, if ever there was one, the kingship was handed to a sickly teenager with a withered left leg, not exactly the most prepossessing candidate for pharaoh, but amenable to pressure and undeniably royal. For Egypt's new monarch, Siptah, was none other than the surviving son of the usurper Amenmais. During Seti II's brief reign, Bey had acted the loyal lieutenant with consummate skill, winning promotion from royal scribe to chancellor, and the rare honor of a tomb in the royal necropolis. It was quite an achievement for any commoner, let alone an outsider of Syrian extraction. Yet, before Seti's mummy had even been laid to rest, Bey switched allegiance to support the polio-stricken son and heir of Seti's arch-nemesis. It was the cruelest betrayal. The kingmaker boasted in public that he established the king on his father's seat. When in reality, Bey's only concern was feathering his own nest. The new king was still underage, so a regency council had to be established. For purposes of legitimacy, it was headed by Seti II's widow Toosret, but not very far behind the scenes, Bey pulled the strings. In the 5th year of the regency, 1193, Toosret took her revenge, adopting full kingly titles, as Hatshepsut had done 280 years earlier. She mobilized her band of supporters at court and made her move against Bey. His fall from grace was swift and absolute. He was executed for treason and his name was officially proscribed, so denying him eternal life. Official documents referred to him instead as the great enemy too, or, sarcastically, as the parvenu from Syria. 3a year later, his protégé, Siptah, was conveniently dead, too. With her enemies deprived of their last rallying point, Toosret launched a full-scale persecution of the puppet king's memory. Siptah's names were erased from his royal tomb, and from hers, to be replaced by those of her late husband, Seti II. The triumph of Meremptah's heirs was complete. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Egypt had been rocked by more than a decade of internecine fighting among Ramses II's descendants. The country had been unsettled and undermined by coup and countercoup, purge and counterpurge. The government was paralyzed and powerless. There was no male heir to continue the line. Instead, the throne was occupied by a vengeful widow, a woman, an affront to the hallowed ideology of Egyptian monarchy. Not 20 years after Meremptah's great victory at Pyrrhic, the country had plumbed the depths, and the blame could be laid squarely at the feet of the ruling dynasty. What Egypt needed was a new broom to sweep away the cobwebs of Ramesside rule and reinvigorate the country's sense of purpose and destiny. Egypt had experienced such moments before. The crisis following the death of Tutankhamun, while no longer within living memory, offered a recent parallel to the situation the country now confronted. Then, the solution had been to turn to the army. If then, why not now? For the second time in a century, the power brokers in Thebes and Memphis looked to the ranks of the military for a strongman to establish a new dynasty and put Egypt back on an even keel. The candidate they chose fit the bill perfectly. An army commander responsible for garrison troops, he had exactly the training and background for a successful soldier pharaoh. He already had a son also in the army, and hence offered dynastic continuity. Even his name, Sethnecht, Seth is victorious, seemed tailor-made. He did not disappoint. Marshalling his forces in 1190, Sethnecht set out to restore order and crush all opposition. Within a matter of months, the military coup was complete. There was no enemy of his Majesty left in any land. For to set the seal on his triumph, he launched a barrage of propaganda to match his martial prowess. On a victory monument erected at Abu, Egypt's traditional southern border, Sethnecht conjured up a bleak picture of life before his arrival on the scene. This land was in desolation. Egypt had strayed from its trust in God. 5. The account went further, alleging a conspiracy by unnamed Egyptian authorities to take over the country with Asiatic help. This veiled reference to Bey played to the Egyptians' oldest and strongest prejudice, their hatred and suspicion of foreigners. Sethnecht was Thusible to present himself not as a military thug but as a national savior, whom the supreme deity had chosen above millions, ignoring hundreds of thousands ahead of him. 6. Like Horemheb before him, Sethnecht had his immediate predecessors airbrushed from history. The party line presented him as the legitimate successor of Seti II. It was a sleight of hand, a careful distortion of the truth worthy of a great pharaoh. Although he was already well past middle age, Sethnecht did not need to worry about his legacy. His son and heir, another Ramses, no less, would see to that. When Ramses III succeeded as king in 1187, he consciously modeled himself on his great namesake, adopting all the names and royal titles of the victor of Kadesh. He even gave his sons the same names and positions at court as Ramses II's sons. And he ordered work to begin on a great mortuary temple in western Thebes, in the mold of the Ramesseum. For officials and ordinary Egyptians alike, it must have seemed like a new dawn, a return to the glorious days of Ozymandias. History was indeed about to repeat itself, but in a way that Ramses III neither desired nor expected. Fight for survival. In the early years of Ramses III's reign, worrying news began to reach Egypt from the pharaoh's emissaries in the Near East. All along the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, cities were being sacked and torched, harbors burned and looted, entire nations laid low. While coastal communities had been harried by pirates for decades, this new onslaught was of an entirely different order of magnitude. Most frightening of all, it had come from out of the blue, the sighting of enemy ships on the western horizon being the first warning of an impending attack. By the time the inhabitants of the Mediterranean ports could muster their defenses, their enemies were upon them. As Egypt watched from afar, great cities and civilizations were reduced to rubble, and the cultural achievements of centuries went up in smoke. The first to fall was the great maritime city of Ugarit. Its altruism was its undoing. The king of Ugarit had dispatched sizable military forces to southern Anatolia in response to pleas for urgent assistance from neighboring lands already under attack. Ugarit's soldiers were fighting alongside the Hittites, while its navy was patrolling the coast of Lycia. By being an exemplary ally, Ugarit had unwittingly put itself in the line of fire. Overstretched and underdefended, its remaining forces were hopelessly incapable of defending Ugarit at home when the attack came. In an 11th-hour attempt to save his entire realm from destruction, the king of Ugarit wrote a desperate letter to his counterpart in Alatia, Cyprus. Its tone of panic is palpable. The enemy ships are already here, they have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the countryside. 7. It was too late. The clay tablet bearing the king's letter was never sent. It was found much later, still in the kiln where it had been fired, amid the rubble of the devastated city, a vivid first-hand account penned on the eve of destruction. Ugarit was laid waste, never to be reoccupied. One of the great natural harbors of the Mediterranean was reduced to smoldering ruins. Next to feel the heat, quite literally, was Egypt's close ally, the Hittite kingdom proper. In a desperate flurry of diplomatic correspondence, the last Hittite ruler spoke of fighting a seaborne enemy, not just on the open seas but on the beaches, on the landing grounds, and in the hills. Fearless and indefatigable, the attackers moved ashore and pushed northward, heading for the Hittite capital at Hattusa. Even with soldiers from Ugarit fighting alongside them, the Hittites could not stop the invaders. In a last-ditch effort to halt the advance, the Hittite king invaded his own neighbor, the coastal territory of Tarhuntassa, seeking to engage the enemy before it could reach the Hittite homeland, but to no avail. First Tarhuntassa and then the Hittite kingdom were defeated and despoiled. Hattusa itself was plundered and burned. The fortified royal citadel proved no match for the invaders. Elsewhere in Asia Minor, the glittering cities of Miletus and Troy suffered a similar fate. As the enemy swarmed like a killer horde across the eastern Mediterranean, Mersin and Tarsus were ravaged, and devastation was visited upon northern Cyprus. Next, the hostile forces pressed inland to the Orontes Valley, sacking all the important towns along this strategic thoroughfare. Alalak, Hamath, Katna, and even Kadesh, all were obliterated. Farther south, the trading centers of Palestine soon succumbed, places such as Akko, Lachish, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, towns that stood astride the great coast road that led southward and westward, to Egypt. Throughout the Near East, palls of smoke hung in the air where once there had been hubs of commerce and culture. Rich palaces and famous cities lay in ruins. Only Assyria, safe on the far bank of the mighty Euphrates, survived unscathed. By 1179, the 8th year of Ramses III's reign, the invaders had the last remaining maritime power of the eastern Mediterranean in their sights. By now, the pharaoh's advisors were well acquainted with the enemy. The foreign countries plotted together in their islands. Their league comprised Pelset, Chikir, Shekelesh, Danayan, and Weshesh. 9. Though the names might be strange, the phenomenon was all too familiar. The dreaded sea peoples had returned. 30 years earlier, a different coalition of Aegean and Anatolian peoples had conspired with the Libyans in an attempted invasion of Egypt in the reign of Meremta. Now new bands had joined together in common cause, sweeping aside all before them. Driven from their homelands, unknown, but possibly the western Mediterranean or Anatolia, by drought, famine, and the desire for a better life, and possessed of a fierce and warlike nature, the sea peoples had proved an unstoppable force as they moved steadily southward and eastward, along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts of Asia Minor, and down the coast of the Near East toward the Sinai and the Nile Delta. Alongside battalions of well-armed, and armored, soldiers came women and children in ox-drawn carts, carrying their meager possessions with them. This was a mass migration by desperate and determined people. So far, no city or state had been able to resist. Egypt knew it faced a battle for survival. At this time of national peril, Ramses III showed himself the true heir of his great predecessor. As soon as he learned of the impending land invasion that was heading toward Egypt from southern Palestine, he sent orders to the frontier fortresses of the eastern delta to stand firm until reinforcements arrived. Troops were mobilized throughout the country. Their orders were to converge on the eastern border and repel the invaders. But the leaders of the sea peoples knew very well that Egypt would be a determined opponent, and had decided to put maximum pressure on the pharaoh's forces by attacking on two fronts. As the land force moved on the delta from the northeast, a substantial amphibious force of troopships made for the mouth of the main Nile branch, intending to land a second army. This army's orders, no doubt, were to follow the river upstream toward the commercial and military headquarters at Pyramids. Possession of the eastern delta capital would effectively mean control of the whole of northern Egypt, just as it had for the Hyksos 450 years earlier. As Ramses and his generals pondered the situation, they realized that Egypt faced not merely a hostile invasion, but the threat of permanent occupation. The response was an immediate nationwide conscription. At its hour of greatest need, the country needed all able-bodied men to stand together. While the professional army dug in at the northeastern border, the conscripts were dispatched to the coast, to blockade the Nile mouth against the enemy fleet. Ramses's own account of the preparations captures very well the tension, drama, and determination of the moment. In the eastern delta fortresses, the Egyptian army could only watch and wait. Their opponents were slow-moving, covering no more than 10 miles a day, but what the sea peoples lacked in speed they more than made up for in weaponry and sheer numbers. Their proficiency in close combat fighting had already proved itself, time and again, against the chariot forces of the Near Eastern states. In little more than a generation, advances in military technology had changed the whole nature of warfare, and the great powers had failed to adapt. Egypt knew it had to do better, or go the same way. Meremta's victory at the Battle of Pyramids had shown that it was possible to defeat the sea people's tactics, if the Egyptians only maintained rigid discipline and used their forces to maximum effect. The troops did not have to wait long to put the theory into practice. As the dust cloud on the horizon grew in intensity, the enemy came into view, a sheer wall of people, hundreds deep, moving inexorably toward the Egyptian border. The moment of truth had arrived. The documentary sources are strangely silent on the details of the land battle, recording only the bald fact that the invasion was defeated. Perhaps the Egyptian losses were simply too heavy to acknowledge publicly. Certainly, the effort involved in repelling the invaders was stupendous. By contrast, the naval battle off the Mediterranean coast seems to have gone Egypt's way from the start, and provided a much more fitting subject for the official war record. The Sea People's Armada, comprising troop carriers rather than warships, had no long-range weapons to pitch against the Egyptian archers on the shore. The pharaoh's generals knew this was their trump card, and realized that if they could only force the enemy inshore, within range, but prevent any landings, victory might be possible. But if just a single troopship managed to break through and disembark its warriors on Egyptian soil, then the tide might turn very quickly. The great flotilla of strange craft got within sight of the shore, great sailing vessels without oars, their prows and sterns carved to resemble the heads of monstrous birds. On board, the enemy warriors looked equally fearsome with their reed helmets and round shields. The Egyptians saw, among the massed ranks of Pelset, Chikir, Danayan, and Weshesh, a more recognizable opponent, the ubiquitous and treacherous Shirdan, with their distinctive horned helmets. Although they had been protectors of Ramses II at Kadesh, the Shirden were now fighting against the forces of another Ramses. As planned, the Egyptian navy maneuvered to force the enemy inshore, right into the Nile mouth. If the invaders thought things were going their way, they were sorely mistaken. No sooner were they within a few hundred yards of the shore than the Egyptian archers opened fire, sending a hail of arrows raining down on the attackers' heads. With the troops on board falling like flies, the commanders of the Sea People's ships may have tried to make for open water again, but they found themselves hemmed in by the Egyptian navy. A great sea battle ensued, in which the enemy craft were systematically capsized, and hundreds of Sea Peoples drowned. By the end of the day, the Egyptians had triumphed, their opponents were either dead or captured. Alone among the great powers of the Near East, Egypt had repelled the Sea Peoples and preserved its independence. Ramses III had spared his country the worst disaster in ancient history, but his victory on the landing grounds of the Delta would prove to be the swan song of the new kingdom. The world was suddenly full of uncertainty, and the accustomed ways of doing things, ways that had served the Egyptians well for centuries, would be found wanting. Out of joint after the bruising encounter with the Sea Peoples, the immediate reaction of the Egyptian government was to bury its head in the sand and carry on as if nothing had changed. Tradition dictated that a great military victory demanded a monumental commemoration, so that is exactly what the king commissioned. Just as Ramses II had used the Ramesseum to celebrate his, questionable, victory at Kadesh, so Ramses III turned his own mortuary temple, closely modeled on his predecessors, into a war memorial. In the mansion of millions of years of King Ramses, united with eternity in the estate of Amun, known today as Medinet Habu, the entire northern wall of the temple was carved with a vast tableau depicting the land and sea battles against the Sea Peoples. So Egypt's last great royal monument commemorated the country's last great military victory. Buoyed up by the completion of so grand an edifice, in 1172, Ramses III ordered the nationwide temple inspection that he had originally planned a decade earlier. After 10 years of defending Egypt's borders, not only against the Sea Peoples, but against 2 attempted Libyan invasions as well, he and his administration finally felt confident enough about national security to turn their attention to the other abiding duty of kingship, honoring the gods. Headed by the chief archivist of the royal treasury, a man with an eye for detail and an interest in historic monuments, the commission started its tour of inspection at Abu, in Egypt's southernmost province, and worked its way northward, slowly but methodically. Every temple in the land was examined with the full panoply of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy. Granaries were audited to assess the extent of temple wealth and the balance of the national grain reserves, buildings were checked for their state of repair, rituals were examined to ensure they were being carried out correctly, and corrupt practices were systematically exposed and rooted out. By the end of the exercise, the king had at his disposal perhaps the most comprehensive survey of the country's religious infrastructure in its long history. Based upon the commission's findings, Ramses ordered an extensive program of reorganization, reconstruction, and refurbishment. The ancient temple of Seth at Nut was restored and a new shrine built alongside it in the deity's honor. The bark shrine at Todd, crafted in the 18th dynasty, was restored to its former glory, and further beautifying works were carried out at nearby Luxor temple. At Ipizit, the country's greatest sacred complex, the king commissioned a new way station and a temple to the god Khonsu. All in all, it was a religious revival, a renaissance of royal patronage to equal the achievements of Ramses II's reign. Explicitly or implicitly, Ramses III was trying to turn back the clock and convince Egypt that the glory days of the new kingdom were still at hand. As well as restoring the temple's physical fabric, the king also enlarged their endowments of land and personnel. Determined to be recognized and remembered as a great benefactor, he ordered 3 expeditions to distant lands in a single year, 1167, expressly to bring back exotic gifts for the temple treasuries. The first expedition was to the turquoise mines of the Sinai. The second had as its goal the copper mines of Edom. These lay at a place called Timnah, about 20 miles north of Eilat, in a desert hollow surrounded by hills. The copper ores here had been exploited by Egypt since the reign of Ramses II, but pharaonic power had waned in the intervening decades, and the Edomites had reasserted their control. So, before he could send in his miners, Ramses III had to launch a military campaign to pacify Edom. Mission accomplished, copper extraction was restarted, and at the conclusion of the expedition, the newly smelted ingots were presented to the king at the palace balcony in Per Ramses. The third foreign expedition was perhaps the most ambitious of all, a 2-month journey to Punt and back, to obtain myrrh and incense for use in temple rituals. It was the first major trading mission to Punt since the reign of Hatshepsut 3 centuries before, and it was spectacularly successful. The Egyptians returned with their precious commodities, and also with the ingredients for domestic myrrh production. 15 cuttings from myrrh trees and 100 seeds. In his first 2 decades on the throne, Ramses III had repelled invasions, restored Egypt's temples, and re-established national pride. The court now looked forward to the king's 30-year jubilee, determined to stage a celebration worthy of so glorious a monarch. There would be no stinting, no corners cut. Only the most lavish ceremonies would do. It was a fateful decision. Beneath the pomp and circumstance, the Egyptian state had been seriously weakened by its exertions. The military losses of 1,179 were still keenly felt. Foreign trade with the Near East had never fully recovered from the Sea People's orgy of destruction. The temple's coffers might be full of copper and myrrh, but their supplies of grain, the staple of the Egyptian economy, were gravely depleted. Against such a background, the Jubilee preparations would prove a serious drain on resources. The cracks started to appear in 1159, 2 years before the Jubilee. Of all the state's employees, the most important, and usually the most favored, were the men who worked on the excavation and decoration of the royal tomb. Living with their families in the gated community of the Place of Truth, they had grown used to enjoying better than average working conditions, and better than average remuneration. So, when the payment of their monthly wages, which also included their food rations, was 8 days late, then 20 days late, it was clear something was badly wrong. Their scribe and shop steward, Amenecht, went at once to the mortuary temple of Horemheb to remonstrate with local officials. Eventually, he persuaded them to hand over 46 sacks of corn to distribute to the workers as interim rations. But that was only the start of it. The following year, as the apparatus of government became increasingly preoccupied with the impending Jubilee, the system of paying the necropolis workers broke down altogether, prompting the earliest recorded strikes in history. The crisis erupted just 3 months before the Jubilee was due to begin. Having waited 18 days beyond their payday and with still no sign of their wages, the workers decided to withdraw their labor. Perhaps then the state would sit up and take notice. Shouting "We're hungry," 12 they marched en masse from their village and temporarily invaded the sacred enclosure surrounding Ramses III's mortuary temple. They then set off for the mortuary temple of Thutmose III, just behind the Ramesseum, and staged a sit-in. They weren't going any here until their grievances were heard. The beleaguered government officials dispatched from the Ramesseum to reason with the strikers had to listen to their litany of protests, but without the authority to remedy the situation. Only at nightfall did the workers return to their village. Their protest had lasted the whole day. The only gesture by the state was a derisory delivery of pastries. If they have no bread, let them eat cake. The next morning, with no resolution of the dispute and no wages in sight, the men stepped up their action, installing themselves at the southern gate of the Ramesseum, Thebes's principal storehouse of grain. This time they refused to return to their village at dusk, instead spending the night in uproarious demonstration. At dawn, a few plucky souls broke into the temple itself, hoping to persuade the authorities to give them their dues. The crisis was getting out of hand. Panicked by the angry workers in their midst, the temple administrators called the chief of police, Montumes, who ordered the men to leave immediately. They refused. Unable or unwilling to assert his authority, Montumes was forced to withdraw, tail between his legs, to consult his boss, the mayor of Thebes. When he returned some hours later, he found the workers deep in negotiations with the priests of the Ramesseum and the local government secretary of western Thebes. The men's demands were clear. Mention of the vizier and the pharaoh clearly unsettled the Theban authorities. If the situation escalated into a national crisis, they knew their jobs, and necks, would be on the line. So, after several more hours of talking, they capitulated and gave the strikers their overdue rations from the previous month. It helped to diffuse the immediate tension, but the underlying problem had still not been addressed. It was now nearly halfway through the new month, with no sign of the next installment of wages. On day 4 of the dispute, news reached the workers that the mayor of Thebes had crossed over to the West Bank with more provisions. The chief of police pleaded with them to go with their wives and children to the nearby mortuary temple of Seti I, to await the mayor's arrival. But the strikers were not so easily fobbed off. They had heard such promises before, and had learned not to trust the weasel words of officials. Indeed, it took another 4 days of protests and marches, including one at night, the men's flaming torches lighting up the sky, to secure the long overdue rations. Still, the state apparatus proved incapable of carrying out its basic duties. 2 weeks after the first series of disputes, the necropolis workers went on strike again, this time taking their protest to the control point leading to the Valley of the Kings. The authorities were beginning to be seriously shaken by these public demonstrations of disobedience, and put pressure on the community leaders to escort the strikers back to their village. Faced with forcible removal, one of the workmen threatened to damage a royal tomb, regardless of the consequences. The mood was turning ugly. The showdown between workers and state authorities culminated just 2 months before the start of the Jubilee year. Striking for a fourth time, the men marched once more from their village, dismissing the shouted pleadings of their superiors with determined obstinacy. "We won't come back. Tell that to your bosses." 14 this time, they made it clear that their grievances were not just about overdue rations but about the broader failings of the administration. For authorities used to a subservient populace, this was dangerous talk indeed. Yet still the ostrich mentality prevailed at the heart of government. A few weeks later, the vizier himself came to Thebes, not to placate the striking workers but to collect cult statues for the imminent Jubilee celebrations. He paid only a fleeting visit to the West Bank and incensed the workers with a small handout from his security chief, provoking yet more demonstrations. When the Jubilee arrived, the authorities' indifference was temporarily put aside in the interests of national unity. Decorum and basic self-interest demanded that the king's big year should pass off without major incident, so the workers were paid on time and in full. But no sooner had the Jubilee passed than the system broke down once more, prompting further, regular strike action. The heart of government was rotten, and the relationship between the state and its workers never fully recovered. Despite the outward show, Egypt's economic vitality and political stability were in serious decline. Treason and plot in the private rooms above the gateway of his mortuary temple. Delicate reliefs show Ramses III in intimate poses with various unnamed women in his household. The king relaxes in a comfortable armchair and plays board games with his youthful companions. They offer him fruit and whisper sweet nothings in the royal ear. "Here's to you, say." 16 The royal harem was a venerable Egyptian institution, providing not just a supply of concubines for the king but also residential facilities and gainful employment for all his female relatives. The harem palace had its own land holdings, its own workshops, and its own administration. It was effectively a parallel court, and such a setup was not without its dangers. As far back as the Old Kingdom, the harem had been a hotbed of plots. There was something about the claustrophobic atmosphere that fed the bitter jealousies and personal rivalries of the king's many wives. With little to occupy their minds besides weaving and idle pleasures, the more ambitious concubines nurtured resentments, angry at the lowly status of their offspring and wondering how they might improve their own and their children's fortunes. When the pharaoh was a strong and successful leader, such murmurings fell away, but when things were going badly in the country at large, the allure of sedition was more tempting. In 1157, when the temporary euphoria of Ramses III's jubilee had died away, the gathering storm clouds were clear for all to see. The king was in failing health and Egypt was in a downward spiral. Desperate times seemed to call for desperate remedies. In the seclusion of the harem palace, one of the king's secondary wives, the Lady T, decided to take matters into her own hands. She revealed her treacherous plan to the director of the harem and his scribe. Her intention was to remove the heir apparent, Prince Ramses, and install her own son, Penaweret, on the throne. Before long, the conspiracy had drawn in many more employees of the harem palace. Even members of the king's inner circle joined the plotters. With the head of the treasury and the royal chamberlain involved, Ramses III and his heir were in grave danger. The plan was both complex and devious. While the ringleaders pursued the main objective, the assassination of Ramses III and the removal of his designated heir, the other harem women would actively spread sedition among their relatives beyond the palace gates, so as to agitate the people and incite conflict, in order to foment rebellion against their lord. 17 One of the women had written to her brother, who was a commander of Nubian troops, to win his support. A mass mutiny among the ranks of the army, combined with a revolution in the countryside, would surely distract and weaken the authorities. Finally, to give their plot the best chance of success, the conspirators turned to darker means. They enlisted the help of professional magicians, mad wax effigies of their opponents, and composed spells designed to paralyze the harem guards. After weeks of careful planning, everything was in place. The stage was set for regicide and revolution. But the plotters had made a fatal error. With so many people involved, it was virtually certain that someone would blab. Before the plans could be carried through to their fateful conclusion, the authorities were alerted and the conspirators arrested. As the details of the plot became clear, so did the extreme level of the threat to national security. Fearing the repercussions of a full, open trial, with himself as the final court of appeal, the king opted instead for a special tribunal. He appointed a group of 12 trusted officials to investigate, pass judgment, and impose an appropriate sentence. Carefully chosen agents of the state, representing the court, the military, and the civil service, would be judge, jury, and executioner. Ramses III's only involvement was to give the tribunal carte blanche in dealing with the plotters. May all that they have done be upon their own heads. 18 With such a remit, the outcome was never in doubt. In a series of 3 prosecutions, 38 individuals were tried and found guilty. The ringleaders were allowed to take their own lives. Some were forced to commit suicide inside the courtroom, while others, including Prince Penaweret, were granted the questionable privilege of doing so outside. All those convicted of treason were further condemned to a second death. Their names were hacked out of their monuments and changed in the official court proceedings to deny them a good memory. Hence the commander of Nubian troops Kamwaset, arisen in Thebes, became Binwaset, evil in Thebes, Murira, beloved of Ra, became Mesed Sura, Ra hates him, and Para-Herwanimf, Ra is at his right hand, became Parakamenef, Ra blinds him. Minor conspirators escaped the death penalty but suffered dreadful mutilations, their noses and ears being cut off to identify them as convicted criminals forever after. As a warning to the population at large, even those who had not been directly involved in the plot but had merely kept silent were punished. Turning a deaf ear to sedition was tantamount to treason. Finally, to wipe away all evidence of the conspiracy and the tribunal established to investigate it, a prosecution was brought against 3 of the judges and 2 officers of the court. On trumped-up charges, they were accused of improper liaison with the plotters. 1 judge was found innocent. The other 2 were condemned to mutilation but, conveniently for the state, committed suicide before the sentence could be carried out. With the tribunal report signed off, the authorities hoped that the whole sorry episode could be safely consigned to history. Except, of course, that it couldn't. It had revealed serious divisions between the ruling dynasty and members of the government, between different factions of the royal family, between the blithe optimism of those in power and the deep malaise in the country at large. The signs could not have been more ominous for the future of Ramesside Egypt. Whether from wounds inflicted by assailants or from natural causes, Ramses III died in 1156, a matter of months after the plot was uncovered. His death marked not just the demise of Egypt's last great pharaoh, but the end of the country's confidence in its own destiny. The unwritten contract between rulers and ruled, an arrangement that had secured Egyptian civilization since the dawn of history, was unraveling. So too, before long, with the very fabric of the state. Chapter 18 Double-edged sword. Sweat and tears. For the average ancient Egyptian, only 2 things in life were certain: death and taxes. From a baby's first breath, the twin specters of dying and destitution haunted every waking moment. Infant mortality was shockingly high, and of those who made it through the perils of childhood, few could look forward to a lifespan of much more than 35 years. It was not just the combination of poverty and a poor diet that reduced life expectancy. In the unsanitary conditions of Egyptian towns and villages, waterborne and infectious diseases were rife. Bilharzia, hepatitis, guinea worm, and amoebic dysentery were inescapable features of everyday life. Those who were not carried off by such unpleasant conditions were often left disfigured or disabled. Visual impairment, caused by illness or injury, was particularly common. The village was full of the bleary-eyed, the one-eyed, and the blind, with inflamed and festering eyelids, of all ages. One as if the afflictions of disease and premature decease were not bad enough, economic circumstances and the structure of the Egyptian state conspired to keep most ordinary people in a state of permanent penury. Even in a good year, the average farm yield amounted to little more than a subsistence income. If a peasant could have kept the entire crop for his own family, he might just have made a tolerable living. However, since in theory the whole of Egypt belonged to the crown, there were taxes due to the authorities for the privilege of farming the pharaoh's land. Like other governments throughout history, ancient Egypt's rulers were particularly adept at collecting these dues, employing a network of local agents to prevent evasion. Moreover, in a pre-monetary economy, the taxes were levied in the form of a share of each farm's agricultural produce, and this had to be handed over, come feast or famine. Defaulters could expect to be thrown in prison, a deeply unwelcome prospect that most did their utmost to avoid. As a result, peasant families always wavered between abject poverty and utter destitution. Too, as in Robin Hood's England, the only escape from overbearing taxation was to abandon the fields completely and go on the run, living as an outlaw on the margins of society. As the new kingdom progressed, an increasing number of people took this desperate step. The hard life of a peasant is documented in unusual detail in a papyrus from the late 20th dynasty. The text tells the story of a man named Werme who fled from his village in Upper Egypt to the great oasis of the Western Desert, modern Dakhla, to seek a better life. Instead, he found himself in even worse circumstances, subject to an uncaring and unscrupulous mayor who had the power to make his people's lives a misery. Not only did the local authorities extract taxation with all their customary ruthlessness, but they feathered their own nests by deliberately reducing the rations doled out to the already hard-pressed peasantry. As a result, the people went hungry while the local bureaucrats prospered. Despised by the literate elite, Egypt's great mass of agricultural workers were put upon and exploited, yet their unremitting and ill-rewarded labor lay at the base of the country's prosperity. In a very real sense, the sweat of their brows built pharaonic civilization, not that the pharaohs or their advisors seemed either to notice or to care. Perhaps the most burdensome and loathed of all forms of taxation was the corvée, a tax paid through labor, on demand, by every able-bodied male in the land, and not officially abolished in Egypt until AD 1889. The only workers exempt from the corvée were those employed by temples that had been granted immunity from the call-up by royal decree. From the earliest history of the Egyptian state, it was the corvée that provided the labor force required for massive government projects, from the quarrying of stone to the building of pyramids and temples. Conscription into the corvée was organized along military lines and, like other forms of taxation, was carried out by local officials, village and town elders acting on the orders of their regional and national superiors. The recruiting sergeants usually came calling at times of the year when the agricultural economy could manage without a large proportion of the workforce, during the inundation, when fields were flooded, or in the growing season, when fewer workers were needed on the land. The draft was indiscriminate and often unfair. Many who were ineligible for duty were nevertheless pressed into service despite their protestations. There was no right of appeal. Fathers found themselves assigned to labor gangs as substitutes for their indigent sons. As peasants were pulled from fields and villages throughout the country, they found themselves locked into a state-run system from which there was little or no chance of escape. Collective punishment was meted out to deserters, with their entire families being held hostage by the authorities against the deserters' eventual return. For deserters who returned or were tracked down, the punishment was a life sentence in a labor gang. Life on corvée duty was hard and unremitting. Under ancient Egyptian law, serious criminals could be sentenced to hard labor, or even banished to the garrison of Kush to work in the appalling conditions of the Nubian gold mines. For ordinary law-abiding subjects, the prospect of forced labor was scarcely less dreadful. Workers were given few freedoms and no luxuries, while rations were at the subsistence level. Only at the end of their period of service could the men return home, assuming they had survived disease and injury. Unfortunately, the standards of health and safety on government projects were abysmally poor, and the casualty rate correspondingly high. The dangers of the corvée were brought into particularly sharp focus in 1153, early in the reign of Ramses IV, during an expedition to the quarries of the Wadi Hammamat. Just 5 months after his accession to the throne, Ramses decided to revive quarrying activity after a 40-year lull. To prepare the ground, he first sent a 408-strong mission to reconnoiter the area and make arrangements at the quarry site for the resumption of large-scale work. After further visits by various bureaucrats over the following months, everything was finally declared ready. So, in the third year of Ramses IV's reign, there set out from Thebes a great expedition, the likes of which Egypt had not witnessed for more than 700 years. In an indication of its national importance, the mission was led by the most powerful figure in Thebes, the high priest of Amun, Ramesnakht. Assisting him were officials both civilian and military. The vizier, an overseer of the treasury, the chief tax officer, the mayor of Thebes, and 2 royal butlers were joined by a lieutenant general of the army, for this was a combined operation. Under their joint control marched a vast conscript army, comprising 2,000 civilian workers, 800 foreign mercenaries, and 5,000 ordinary soldiers. The use of the army for civil projects during the winter months was a pragmatic policy. It kept the soldiers busy and under the watchful eye of the king's advisors at a time when campaigning was undesirable, because of the rainy season in the Near East, and when they might otherwise have been idle. The Ramesside pharaohs appreciated the coercive power of a large standing army, but were also wise enough to recognize the political dangers of a military force with too much time on its hands. Quarrying stone was essentially a hard, manual task, so Ramses IV's expedition included only a small contingent of skilled workers, just 4 sculptors and 2 draftsmen, to supervise the work. By contrast, there were 50 policemen and a deputy chief of police to keep the workers in line and prevent desertion. Once at the quarry face, the men toiled and sweated at their backbreaking work, for long days on end. Their meager rations, brought by ox cart from the Nile Valley, consisted largely of the basics, bread and beer, enlivened by the occasional sweet cake or portion of meat. Natural cisterns hollowed out of the rock were designed to trap rainwater for drinking, but in the parched landscape of the eastern desert rain was always in short supply, even in winter. Back in the days of Ramses II, gold mining expeditions would routinely lose half of their workforce and half their transport donkeys from thirst. Seti had taken measures to reduce this startling loss of life by ordering wells to be dug in the eastern desert, but the incidence of death on corvée missions remained stubbornly high. Hence, the great commemorative inscription carved to record Ramses IV's Wadi Hammamat expedition ends with a blunt statistic. After listing the 9,000 or so members who made it back alive, it adds, almost as an afterthought, and those who are dead and omitted from this list, 900 men. The statistic is chilling. An average workman on state corvée labor had a 1 in 10 chance of dying. Such a loss was considered neither disastrous nor unusual. In ancient Egypt, life was cheap. Downward spiral. Unwelcome as it may have been, forced labor was, in theory, part of the contract between the Egyptian people and their rulers. In return for his subjects' daily toil, the king guaranteed the eternal order of the cosmos, appeasing the gods and ensuring Egypt's continued prosperity. Even in the minds of the hard-pressed and downtrodden peasantry, it could just about be defended as a worthwhile exchange. Except that, after the death of Ramses III, the country's rulers signally failed to keep their side of the bargain. Following the turmoil surrounding his father's demise, Ramses IV looked forward to better times. Since Egypt has come into his lifetime, a joyful period has come about for Egypt. 3. As a further sign of his hopes for renewed glory, he modeled his royal titles closely on those of his illustrious forebear Ramses II, and even planned to outdo the mighty Ozymandias in longevity. On a stela dedicated at Abju in the 4th year of his reign, Ramses IV instructed the gods, double for me the extended lifespan and the great reign of King Usermatra Setapenra. Ramses II, the great god. 4. Next to a long lifespan, every pharaoh's wish was for his heirs to succeed him in an unbroken line. In Ramses IV's case this desire was made even more acute by bitter experience. Mindful of the harem plot that had so nearly deprived him of the kingship, he hectored Egypt's chief deities, asking, nay, telling, them, confer my great office on my heirs. Behold, the disaffected are the abomination of your majesties. 5. If he, Ramses, carried out his duty to beautify the gods' temples and increase their offerings, then they should deliver the quid pro quo and grant his requests. But the gods were no longer listening. To mark his accession, Ramses IV had authorized a handout of silver to the workmen of the royal tomb, to win their goodwill and denture conscientious work on his sepulchre. He had also doubled the workforce from 60 to 120 for good measure. Yet his tomb was, in the end, rather small and poorly finished. Despite his wish for glory and his penchant for ambitious projects, none of the king's temple buildings was ever completed. Egypt's economy was faltering, its government ossifying. There was neither the means nor the will, it seemed, to sustain the level of patronage that had characterized the golden age of the new kingdom. And so much for a long reign. Ramses IV had asked the gods for 134 years on the throne. Fate allotted him just 6. 1156 to 1150. Where Ramses IV had struggled to keep up the appearance of royal authority, his successors gave up all pretense. While they all took the name Ramses, so great was its prestige, none of them showed the same determination, resolve, or leadership as their two famous namesakes. Egypt was fortunate not to face another mass invasion on the scale of the Sea People's attack under Ramses III, but its borders were far from secure against hostile incursions. Even though There was no longer a superpower in the Near East against which Egypt needed to defend its interests, as it had when facing the Hittites. Under Ramses II, there were threats, nonetheless, to Egypt's imperial possessions. Yet none of Ramses IV's successors was able or willing to give proper attention to the country's foreign or security interests, so preoccupied was the administration with the deteriorating situation at home. The brief 5-year reign of Ramses V, 1150 to 1145, revealed the depths to which the country had sunk. The pharaoh's accession and coronation ceremonies had barely been completed before the government uncovered a serious corruption scandal. It transpired that, for nearly a decade, a ship's captain named Knumnik had been busy appropriating for his own profit substantial quantities of grain destined for the temple of Khnum at Abu. After collecting the grain from one of the temple's estates in the delta, it was Knumnik's job to take it hundreds of miles upstream to the temple granaries on Egypt's southern border. In fact, during the course of the long voyage, aided and abetted by various farmers, scribes, and inspectors, and encouraged by a corrupt priest, he siphoned off a significant proportion of each delivery. By the time he was found out, more than 5,000 sacks of barley had been stolen. The investigation into Knumnik's crimes soon revealed the true extent of corruption among the Abu priesthood. One of the priests had not only stolen equipment from the temple treasury, but he had also rustled calves of the sacred myrrh ware, also known as Nevis, bull, believed to be an embodiment of the sun god Ra. This was not merely theft, it was sacrilege. Hundreds of miles from the royal residence at Ramses, and far from the gaze of government officials, state employees in distant parts of the realm had decided to put their hands into the till, confident that their misdemeanors would go undetected. It was the ultimate indictment of the pharaonic administration, by now so paralyzed that not even its own officials afforded it any respect. Central control over the entire Nile Valley, assisted by reliable and swift communication, had been the sine qua non of the Egyptian state. With local communities now effectively doing their own thing, the prospects for national cohesion looked increasingly grim. Shaken by such a serious breakdown in economic and political control, Ramses V determined to restore some measure of order. As earlier pharaohs had recognized, a proper census of national wealth was a prerequisite for effective government, so Ramses commissioned a survey of landholdings in a 95-mile stretch of Middle Egypt, paying particular attention to grain production and tax collection. The result was a papyrus register some 33 feet long, an impressive document indeed. But its royal author, like his administration, was in failing health, and he succumbed to smallpox before the survey's findings could be implemented. In a further sign of government weakness, his pockmarked mummy lay unburied for a year while a modest tomb was hurriedly prepared to receive it. Ramses V's intended sepulchre had been summarily usurped by his successor. In uncertain times, it was every man for himself. By now, the situation at Thebes was deteriorating fast. Soaring grain prices reflected the weakness of the economy and the failure of the government to guarantee wages. Contemporary accounts hint at hunger, even starvation, as the peasantry bore the full brunt of the hard times. Hyenas were spotted in the Theban hills, scenting death in the villages below. With tax revenues falling and the court unable to pay for new royal monuments, Ramses VI, 1145 to 1137, took drastic steps to economize. On the west bank, he halved the workforce of tomb builders to 60 men. On the east bank, at Ipizit, he simply recarved the additions built by Ramses IV, to claim them as his own. The malaise was not just a matter of economic weakness. There was also a security dimension. Ever since the reign of Ramses III, Egypt had faced repeated incursions by Libyan tribespeople seeking to leave their parched lands and settle in the fertile Nile Valley. They spend all day marauding the land, fighting daily to fill their bellies. They came to the land of Egypt to seek sustenance for their mouths. In the space of 6 years, Egypt's last great pharaoh had repelled 2 attempted Libyan invasions, but had failed to prevent attacks against the Theban region at the end of his reign. Now, with the organs of the State atrophying and the government machine unable to defend Egypt's borders. The Libyan incursions increased in frequency. Under Ramses V, work on the royal tomb halted altogether for a time as the workers stayed at home for fear of the enemy, a foe that had already ransacked and burned at least one Theban village. In his choice of royal titles and his scenes of military triumph on temple walls, Ramses VI might have pretended to be Egypt's defender, but the old magic had worn off. The king's protestations were hollow boasts, and they fooled nobody. As garrisons were hastily recalled to maintain national security, Egypt ceased copper mining at Timna, abandoned the turquoise terraces of the Sinai, and lost control of its last hard-won possessions in the Near East. So ended the Egyptian Empire, not with a bang but with a whimper. The land of the pharaohs had been reduced from the greatest power in the eastern Mediterranean to a weak and beleaguered nation in just 4 generations. Cruel fate dealt pharaonic prestige the final blow. In happier times, a rapid succession of monarchs could have been managed. Now, a series of short reigns seemed to underline the ineffectiveness of Egypt's rulers. Divine kingship looked like an increasingly academic concept. The all-too-obvious mortality of Ramses VI, VII, and VIII, all 3 dying within an 11-year period, merely emphasized their lack of credit with the gods. Politics abhors a vacuum, and as the influence of the royal court declined, so the stock of the great families of provincial Egypt rose. At Thebes in particular, the most important offices were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of aristocratic dynasties. Offices passed from father to son, in accordance with the Egyptian ideal but ignoring the superior ideal of the royal prerogative. The king exercised less and less real influence as state offices became quasi-hereditary. This trend was exemplified by the richest and most powerful figure in Thebes for most of the late 20th dynasty, the high priest of Amun. Ramessnaked. His loyalist name, Ramses is victorious, was all for show. In reality, the high priest and his family were the effective rulers of Thebes and, with it, much of southern Egypt. Ramessnaked saw off no less than 6 pharaohs, serving from the last years of Ramses III into the reign of Ramses IX. The high priest, not the king, was the new linchpin of the Theban government. Ramessnaked saw to it that he was succeeded by his 2 sons in turn, Nesemun and Amenhotep. When the latter had himself depicted at Ipizit, it was at the same scale as his sovereign. There could be no clearer indication of the hemorrhaging of royal status beyond the temple walls. Crime and cover-up. The sanctity of the royal tomb was a fundamental tenet of ancient Egyptian belief from the very beginning of pharaonic history. If the prosperity of the land depended upon divine will, and the well-being of the gods, upon the ministrations of the king, then the eternal survival and benevolence of the monarch was in everyone's interests. The royal tomb was designed not merely as a final resting place for an Egyptian ruler but as his passport to the next world and his guarantee of rebirth. As such, it was the single most important structure in the country. The ideal of inviolability had been rudely shattered during the civil unrest of the First Intermediate Period, when the Old Kingdom pyramids had been robbed and desecrated with impunity. A similar fate seems to have befallen the Middle Kingdom pyramids during the dark days of Hyksos rule. So the switch to hidden subterranean, rock-cut tombs under the rulers of the New Kingdom had brought with it a renewed hope that the mummies of Egypt's monarchs would be allowed to rest in peace for all eternity. However, human nature being what it is, the discord and uncertainty at the end of the 18th dynasty had prompted opportunistic attempts to rob some of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Despite the king's best endeavors to hide their sepulchres from prying eyes and grasping hands, knowledge of the tomb's whereabouts had clearly leaked out. Horemheb had sought to counter this threat by reforming the workman's village at the place of truth. Out went the transient, even casual workforce of earlier reigns, in came a rigidly controlled and closed community, with death the only means of exit. In return for their vow of perpetual silence, the workmen and their families could expect to be looked after by the state, receiving guaranteed employment and better than usual rations. The most successful Workers could even look forward to a degree of prosperity in a tomb of their own in the hillside above the village. It was a contract designed to appeal to the self-interest of both parties. The strikes of 1158 dealt a blow to this long-standing agreement between the king and the workers of the tomb. If the state was no longer committed to paying the men on time and in full, why should the men protect the state's most jealously guarded secret? Little wonder, then, that amid the economic and political collapse of the late 20th dynasty, not even the tombs in the Valley of the Kings were considered sacrosanct. The first serious incident took place early in the reign of Ramses IX, 1126 to 1108, when robbers broke into the tomb of Ramses VI, sealed only a decade earlier. This act of sacrilege was followed a few years later by the wanton vandalism of two of the greatest monuments on the west bank of Thebes, the mortuary temples of Ramses II and Ramses III. Fortunately for the government, the thieves and vandals did relatively little damage on these occasions. A formal investigation, headed by the high priest of Amun, was launched, and security was no doubt tightened. But to little effect. Within a short time, the robbers were back, their soft target the less well-guarded royal necropolis of the 17th dynasty on the hillside behind the Ramesseum. The thieves had little need to case the joint first. As inhabitants of the workman's village, they knew every inch of the Theban necropolis like the backs of their hands. So, one night in 1114, a stonemason by the name of Emun Painfer set out with his band of accomplices to commit the crime of the century, entering one of the royal tombs. Having thoroughly pillaged the tomb of Sobekemsf II for all its valuables, the robbers unceremoniously set fire to the coffins of the king and his consort, reducing their chests of life to smoldering ashes. It was an astonishing act of desecration and blasphemy. The actions of the pharaoh's own employees were now actively undermining the foundations of the state. Not that the robbers were remotely concerned with the theological implications of their actions. For them, all that mattered was the spoils, all 32 golden pounds of it. That more than compensated for the state's late rations. When the robbery finally came to light 4 years later, all the government could do was punish the ringleaders and set up a royal commission to investigate what had happened, still a convenient substitute for decisive action. But a royal commission in the absence of royal authority was meaningless. It simply served to stoke the bitter rivalry between Thebes' two most important civilian officials. Heading the commission was the mayor of Thebes, Pazer. Hampering it by every means at his disposal, fair or foul, was the mayor of Western Thebes, Poura, whose jurisdiction included the royal necropolis. The two men saw in the investigation a golden opportunity for one-upmanship. While Pazer was determined to use the investigation to assert his authority and take his antagonist down a peg or two, Poura was equally resolved to eliminate his rival once and for all. The commission's findings must have made depressing reading. Back in the government offices of Per-Ramses, of the 10 royal tombs inspected, only one was still intact. Some had been partly robbed, others completely ransacked. Faced with such a calamity, it was time to find a scapegoat. Yet no sooner had the commission implicated Poura than he struck back, fighting for his political life. And for life itself, since the penalty for robbing a royal tomb was death. Poura pulled out all the stops and called in every favor. With the help of the vizier Kamwaset, he managed to overrule the commission's findings and emerge unscathed. At the end of the whole process, both Pazer and the vizier had mysteriously disappeared from scene, as had the robbers themselves. No witnesses. Poura survived and prospered. The robberies continued. 3 decades and several high-profile thefts later, a second royal commission was set up by Ramses XI, 1099 to 1069. This time, to reduce the likelihood of cover-up, the inquiry was led by the vizier himself, as the king's personal representative in Upper Egypt, assisted by the royal treasurer and 2 royal butlers. If the government was showing how seriously it took the problem, it was little prepared for the scale of the corruption that its investigations uncovered. Once again, most of the men involved in robbing the royal tombs came from the workman's village. But this time they had not acted alone. The Commission found evidence of widespread negligence and complicity among state and temple officials. Some had turned a blind eye to crimes carried out under their noses, others had actively collaborated in theft, sharing in the spoils. One of the suspects questioned by the tribunal had professed innocence, arguing, "I saw the lesson that was meted out to the thieves in the time of the vizier came was said. Is it likely, then, that I would set out to seek such a death?" 8. But the commission concluded that he was lying. Another robber decided to confess from the outset, recounting how he and 4 accomplices had emptied a tomb of its silver vessels and divided the spoils among them. The commission was suspicious of this unforced confession, so ordered the man to be examined with the stick, birch, and screw. But he stuck to his story. "I didn't see anything else, what I saw is what I've said." After a second beating and the promise of many more, he broke down. "Stop, I'll talk." 9. A little light torture worked wonders. As the net was cast wider, the authorities started to reel in some bigger fish. A theft from the great temple of Amun-Ra at Ipizit, arguably the most sacred place in the whole of Egypt, had been particularly audacious, striking at the heart of the regime's theological power base. On further investigation, the chief guard of the temple was found to have been behind the robbery. The conclusion was stark: corruption was now endemic at every level of the priesthood and the government. At Thebes in particular, repeated Libyan incursions combined with food shortages and starvation had led to a complete breakdown of law and order. People no longer felt secure, personally or economically. They no longer trusted in the state's ability to defend them or provide for them. Nor did they fear the state's power to hold them in check or prevent them from taking the law into their own hands. After half a millennium of stability, the edifice of the state was crumbling and collapsing with alarming rapidity. Egypt stood on the brink of anarchy. Desperate remedies. The government of Egypt during the Ramesside period was divided into 4 broad, functionally distinct units. Supporting the activities of the court was the royal domain, administered by a chancellor and a chief steward. The civil service, headed by 2 viziers, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt, was responsible for taxation, agriculture, and justice. The army, under its commander-in-chief, often a royal prince, played a relatively minor part in government, despite its prominent role as an instrument of foreign policy. Last but not least there was the religious establishment, led by the overseer of priests of all the gods of Upper and Lower Egypt. More often than not this exalted post was held by the high priest of Amun. Ever since the latter years of Ramses III, the high priest of the country's preeminent cult had been the most powerful individual in Upper Egypt, wielding more influence than the mayor of Thebes or even the southern vizier. The great temple of Amun-Ra at Ipizit was the largest landowner in the region, controlling vast estates with thousands of tenant farmers. It also had extensive workshops employing hundreds of craftsmen, and its granaries, attached to the mortuary temples of Ramses II and III, acted as the main reserve bank not just for Thebes but for Upper Egypt as a whole. The man who controlled Ipizit and its economic wealth controlled Thebes. As kings came and went, this most prestigious sinecure was monopolized by one family, that of Ramessnakht. In troubled times, this local dynasty provided some measure of continuity and stability, even if it could not bring much succor to the common people's increasingly blighted lives. Then, in 1091, the unrest sweeping Thebes came home to roost. Hungry, desperate, and frustrated by the high priest Amenhotep's intransigence, a group of Thebans succeeded in forcibly removing him from office and replacing him with a new man of their choosing. For 8 months, Amenhotep languished at home, shorn of the trappings of power, deprived of his accustomed wealth, politically isolated. For a proud scion of Thebes's leading family, it was quite a come down. Worse still, there was only one person in Egypt who could reinstate a high priest, and that was the king. Groveling to the pharaoh was an unwelcome prospect for Amenhotep, but he knew it was the only path back to power. So, swallowing his pride, he petitioned Ramses XI, far away in the royal residence at Per-Ramses, to restore him to his rightful office. Ramses was caught between a rock and a hard place. If he failed to respond to Amenhotep's pleadings and left the usurper in place at Ipitsit, it would be an admission of impotence, effectively signaling the end of the king's reign in Upper Egypt. If, however, he took steps to restore Amenhotep to the high priesthood, it would merely confirm the supremacy of a family that had been building its own power base for generations at the expense of the Ramesside dynasty. Neither option was particularly attractive, but restoring the status quo ante seemed marginally preferable. The only question was how to achieve the desired outcome. Reports from Thebes indicated that the usurper was not going to go quietly. Considerable force would be needed to dislodge him from the heavily fortified enclosure at Jim, modern Medinet Habu. Yet the king was hundreds of miles away in the delta, as were most of Egypt's troops. Sending them southward to unseat a high priest would carry two unacceptable risks: drawing the king into the bitter internal politics of Thebes while leaving the royal residence exposed and vulnerable to attack. There was only one other garrison with enough troops to carry out the operation, and that was stationed in Nubia, under the command of the viceroy of Kush. So Ramses sent an order to the viceroy, Panzi, to march north with his Nubian troops as quickly as possible, to suppress the interloper. It was a fatal error of judgment. Within weeks, Panzi had arrived at Thebes in force, and his Nubian soldiers were at the gates of Medinet Habu. An unruly mob stormed the temple enclosure, driving out the usurper and vandalizing the buildings. Other troops rampaged across the West Bank, causing damage to its sacred monuments. The operation was a military success but a public relations disaster. Once order had been restored and Amenhotep reinstated as high priest, Panzi moved swiftly to assess the damage, recover stolen property, and punish those responsible. Some culprits were summarily executed on the viceroy's orders, without waiting for the inconvenience of a trial. In such situations, making an example of a few individuals usually did the job of keeping the rest in line. The inhabitants of Thebes suddenly remembered the roughness of military justice. Having imposed law and order, Panzi moved to seize control of the Theban economy, taking charge of the temple granaries. Amenhotep could hardly complain, given that he owed his restoration to the Nubian strongman. By 1087, Panzi was styling himself as general and overseer of the granaries of the pharaoh. He, not the high priest of Amun, was now the de facto ruler of Upper Egypt. For a while, the viceroy loyally governed Thebes on behalf of the king, but Ramses XI was becoming increasingly concerned about his subordinates' growing power. He could sense Thebes and the south slipping away, and was determined to reassert royal authority at all costs. Egypt's empire was no more, its borders were porous, and its people were starving. If he could no longer preserve even the country's territorial integrity, a pharaoh would not be worthy of the name, nor could he call himself a true Ramses. From their earliest origins, the Ramessides had been a military dynasty, using military personnel and military solutions to govern Egypt. Now, having unleashed one general and come to regret it, Ramses XI might have thought twice about doing the same again. Yet, with his options fast running out, all he could do was fall back on his instincts. In 1082, the king duly summoned one of his northern generals, Payank, and ordered him to march against Panzi and drive the upstart viceroy back into Nubia. The result was civil war. Panzi was a skilled enough tactician not to sit and wait for the onslaught, but to take the fight to the enemy. He rounded up the Theban garrisons and, bolstered by local conscripts, marched north with his army to engage Payank's forces. At first, the viceroy's advance met with considerable success. Reaching Hardi, in Middle Egypt, he stormed and ransacked the town. For a moment, it seemed that the king's army might lose the war. But Payank's greater numbers eventually prevailed, and by 1080 Panzi had been driven out of Egypt. The disgraced viceroy of Kush was back where he belonged, in far-off Nubia. The conflict may have saved face for Ramses XI, but it was a disaster for Thebes. The depletion of the local garrisons and the conscription of men of fighting age led to a security vacuum across the City. Widespread looting of temples and tombs broke out and went unchecked for months. The tomb of Ramses VI was targeted for a second time and its sarcophagus attacked. Worse still, as Pansy's army retreated, it carried out a scorched earth policy, ravaging monuments in an orgy of destruction. When the dust finally settled, the pharaoh visited Thebes, in a rare outing from his Delta residence, to see for himself the extent of the damage. It was a deeply depressing sight. Not since the dark days of the country's first civil war, 1,000 years earlier, had so much devastation been inflicted by fellow Egyptians. In a vain attempt to turn back the clock and start afresh, Ramses declared the beginning of a new era. The 19th year of his reign was to be known instead as the first year of the Renaissance, and subsequent years would follow the new nomenclature. But nobody was fooled, least of all Payank, for he, not Ramses, was the undoubted victor against Pansy. To prove the point, Payank took over the viceroy's titles and dignities, followed by those of the high priest as well. General, overseer of granaries, and high priest of Amun, military, economic, and religious authority were now combined in one person. The restoration of pharaonic authority in Thebes had in fact been just another military putsch, except that Payank had learned from history. While the viceroy had enjoyed only a brief period of absolute power, Payank's regime would be designed to stand the test of time. An army man through and through, brusque, determined, and ruthlessly efficient, Payank ruled Thebes with a rod of iron. He took pains to build a network of influential supporters, surrounding himself with men and women of ability. One such was his wife Nojmet, a woman of considerable resolve and personal authority. Payank's first policy, after imposing martial law in Thebes, was to lead his army into Nubia in pursuit of the renegade Pansy. Only by securing its southern flank against a repeat attack could the new military junta achieve lasting security. While Payank was on maneuvers in Nubia, he left the running of Thebes in his wife's capable hands. The two corresponded regularly, keeping each other informed about major developments. One particular exchange of letters underlines the dark side of military rule. In Payank's absence, unease about the regime was growing in Thebes, and Nojmet wrote to her husband to report on seditious statements made by two policemen. Even the forces of law and order were beginning to mutter against the junta. Payank's reply was unequivocal and chilling. Interrogation followed by disappearance, the classic fate of dissidents under a military regime. Political assassinations were not the only murky activities sponsored by Payank in his bid to retain power. In another letter from the Nubian front, he ordered two of his Theban henchmen, Buthamun and Kar, to perform an unnamed task on which you have never before embarked. 11. The euphemistic phraseology was carefully chosen, for the task in question was nothing less than state-sponsored tomb robbery. The war against Pansy showed no signs of a swift resolution, and Payank badly needed funds to finance his military operations and shore up his regime at home. The Theban hills offered a ready treasure trove of gold and silver, buried in the tombs of Egypt's kings, queens, and high officials. So Payank's men set out on a deliberate policy of breaking and entering, channeling the proceeds of their crime back to the government coffers. As they roamed the West Bank in search of tomb entrances, they marked what they found for systematic future clearance. Buthamun alone left more than 130 graffiti, identifying the repositories of wealth amassed by generations of pious Thebans. Having survived Libyan attack, opportunistic robbery, and civil war, the remaining intact tombs of the new kingdom pharaohs were now ruthlessly exploited by the rulers themselves. A final taboo had been broken. After a decade of rule, the junta faced its sternest test when Payank died unexpectedly. His sons were too young to take over, and the prospect of an interregnum was deeply unwelcome for a regime that had not yet consolidated its grip on power. So, postponing a dynastic succession in favor of a stopgap solution, Payank's supporters moved swiftly and stabilized the situation by choosing another army general, Herihor, as interim leader. He was an inspired choice. A Mature and capable leader in Payang's mold, Herihor came from the same officer class. He was as vigorous in his private life as he was in military matters, fathering 19 sons. Yet none of them was to succeed him. Payang's widow saw to that. In a brilliantly calculated move, Nojmet immediately took Herihor as her new husband, at a stroke bolstering his position and retaining her influence over the eventual succession. That succession left no room for the Ramesside royal family. While Herihor strengthened the rule of the generals in Upper Egypt, another army man, the king's son-in-law Nzbenjedet, took effective power. In the north of the country, Egypt was now a nation of two halves, each ruled by a military elite. Though Herihor and Nzbenjedet paid lip service to the continued reign of Ramses XI, there was no denying where real power lay. Isolated and a virtual prisoner in his own royal residence, the last of the Ramessides had seen pharaonic authority slip from his grasp, through a combination of poor decisions and benign neglect. The same army that had brought the 19th and 20th dynasties to power was presiding over the country's formal division. Military might had proved a double-edged sword indeed. As Ramses XI lay on his deathbed in 1069, after 30 years on the throne, the Nile itself seemed to signal the end of an era. The great river's Pelusiac branch, on which Per-Ramses had been founded 2 centuries earlier, had been silting up for some time. By the end of Ramses XI's reign, the main channel was so clogged with sediment that ships were no longer able to use the city's harbors. It was a fitting metaphor for the regime's own sclerosis. Starved of commerce and communication, the traders, scribes, and bureaucrats abandoned Per-Ramses in favor of a new site, Dianat, modern San el-Hagar, some 12 miles to the north. As the old king's funeral cortege wound its way from the royal palace of Per-Ramses, followed by a clutch of old retainers, the Ramesside dynasty and its seat of government died together.